Hello everybody, welcome to this lecture on the goddess Aphrodite and the god Eros. We'll be covering them first in their major myths and then moving on closer to the end of the lecture to the ancient Greek poetess Sappho and also Apuleius' myth of Eros and Psyche. Birth, arising, or anatos of Aphrodite we covered already in the lecture on Hesiod's Theogony. Just a brief recap, when Kronos cut off Uranos' genitals with a sickle, not only Aphrodite was produced from the testicles when they fell into Pontos, the sea, but also the Erinyes or Furies, the giants, and the nymphs of Meliae, the ash tree nymphs, were born. So we might expect these deities, who are either more savage and elemental or more mild and tender, would be particularly close to Aphrodite in myth. This was far from the only myth of Aphrodite's birth, however. The philosopher Epimenides, who was the original Greek Rumpelstiltskin, incubating in a cave for a very long time and then waking up with wisdom and truth, this Epimenides makes Aphrodite the sister of the Moirai and of the Erinyes and says that her parents are Kronos and Eurynome. This may have been the form that Aphrodite took in some Greek communities prior to the arrival of Aphrodite Cytherea, or Cypriot Aphrodite from the east. In Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, sometimes called irreverently Venus on the Half-Shell, we've seen already a more modest Aphrodite. The Greek reality, however, was seldom if ever modest. One of Aphrodite's main attributes is lust or wantonness, and her birth, as we've seen, is gruesome. Her main epithets, folk etymologized in Hesiod, include Cytherea, because she came to the island of Cythera first after being born, and next arose on the island of Cyprus, from which she gets the epithet Cyprogenes. And Hesiod gives us a third epithet, Philomedes, which could mean neither genital-loving or smile or laughter-loving. When Hesiod's Aphrodite arrives on land, there this majestic and fair goddess came out, and soft grass grew all around her soft feet. Fair Himeros and Eros became her companions when she was born and when she joined the gods. Both Homer and the Homeric hymn suppress the gruesomeness of Aphrodite's birth. And Homer speaks of Aphrodite as a child born of Zeus and Dione. We've also already covered the role Aphrodite played in the creation of Pandora in the Prometheus lecture, as well as her children with Ares, that is Terror, Panic, and Harmonia in the Hera lecture. Here you see probably the best cinematic recreation of the birth of Aphrodite that I've seen, with Uma Thurman playing Aphrodite in the wonderful film The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. For another modern retelling of the myth of the birth of Aphrodite, I've also included in the course pack Rilke's poem, The Birth of Venus. And we'll cover a bit more about Rilke's work and its relation to classical mythology when we get to our unit on Orpheus and read Rilke's Sonnets to Orpheus. This week I've included a few of Rilke's new poems from 1902, connected to Greek myth to get us started with Rilke, The Birth of Venus, and also a few poems he wrote about Sappho and her disciple Erinnah. His Birth of Venus begins in the morning after that night which fearfully has passed in outcry, tumult, uproar. The sea splits open once again and screamed. And as the scream slowly closed again, and from the sky's pale light and brightness fell back into the mute fish's chasm, the sea gave birth. Bonus points this week for interpreting Rilke's beautiful poem in the discussion and evaluating how it utilizes some traditional elements of Aphrodite's birth myth and what it adds and augments. The next two epithets of Aphrodite we should mention, after the basic Hesiodic ones, and since these become especially prominent in Aphrodite worship in the classical period, are Aphrodite Urania, who is celestial, ethereal, sublime, and sacred, and Aphrodite Pandemos, who is the common, profane, or universal goddess of sex. Oddly, although heavenly Aphrodite is the same one we hear about in Hesiod's Theogony, she comes to be increasingly associated with spiritual love as a goddess of love in poetry, philosophy, and Greek religion. By classical times, Aphrodite Pandemos seems to be almost a different goddess, her parents being Dione and Zeus, and her appearances invariably bound up with lust, sexual satisfaction, and procreation. Eventually, Hellenistic and later Christian writers will ditch Aphrodite Pandemos altogether and desexualize Aphrodite Urania to such an extreme degree that she can become identified in some Christian theologians even with the Virgin Mary. Now, as the textbook notes, usually Aphrodite appears as a goddess of beauty, love, and marriage. But she's also a goddess of the sea, war, gold, anguish, heartbreak, adultery, transgressive secrets, shamelessness, and the glories of sexual rapture. In archaic and classical Greek consciousness, Aphrodite comes to presence wherever there is powerful sexuality, from the marriage bed to the temple bed, or even in the dangerous wilderness. Aphrodite might also crown a festival or inspire a battlefield, as she often does in the Iliad. She has a large retinue of associated gods and is also frequently depicted with Hermes, Dionysus, Pan, or Zeus. We know that from a very early date she had temples on the islands of Cyprus, Cythera, Salamis, Ephesus, Paphos, and Corinth, Athens, and basically everywhere. The textbook goes on to note the likelihood but lack of evidence for widespread temple prostitution in an Aphrodite cult, and even calls these priestesses of Aphrodite temple harlots. This is the language of earlier generations, and I'm looking forward to when it's decisively phased out. Whatever the various roles of Aphrodite's priestesses were, even when sexual, this would have been very far from what the Greeks themselves understood as mere prostitution. Prostitutes are harlots, being called pornoi, from which we get the English porno. Often in the surviving sources, either priestesses of Aphrodite or other types of devotees of her are not called pornoi but rather hetaira, or educated high-class courtesans, the word hetaira itself simply meaning companion, like our English escort. Lots of debate exists over how much the social roles of hetaira and sacred priestesses of Aphrodite overlap or diverge. If these topics interest you for an essay project, there's lots of books which cover this, and I especially like James Davidson's The Greeks and Greek Love, and also his earlier Courtesans and Fish Cakes, The Consuming Passions of Classical Athens. In most Greek art, literature, and religion, it's her sexual attributes that are emphasized. Soft curves, voluptuousness, and a relative or complete nudity. Aphrodite's adornments and other instruments of allurement and persuasion are often represented, such as her magic girdle. More than many other Greek gods, Aphrodite is a highly social goddess. Whenever she appears, it is usually with a large retinue, much like Dionysus. The members of their retinues also frequently overlap. On the appearance and attendance of Aphrodite, we can begin with the 6th Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. There are 2 others. Of August, gold-wreathed and beautiful Aphrodite I shall sing, to whose domain belong the battlements of all sea-laved Cyprus, where, blown by the moist breath of Zephyros, she was carried over the waves of the resounding sea in soft foam. The gold-filleted Horai, hours or seasons, happily welcomed her and clothed her with heavenly raiment. Then on her divine head they placed a well-wrought crown, beautiful and golden, and in her pierced ears flowers of brass and precious gold. Round her tender neck and silver-white breasts they decked her out with golden necklaces, such as the gold-filleted Horai themselves are adorned with whenever they go to lovely dances of the gods and to their father's house. And after they decked her body with every sort of jewel, they brought her to the immortals, who saw and welcomed her, giving her their hands, and each one wished that he might take her home as his wedded wife, for they all marveled at the looks of violet-crowned Cytherea. Hail, honey-sweet goddess with the fluttering eyelids! Grant me victory in this context and arrange my song, and I shall remember you and another song too. The late 19th century French symbolist painter Gustave Moreau seems to have this hymn in mind when he depicts Aphrodite on the left here with a beautiful crown, although seldomly do painters include each attribute of her appearance as sung in the Homeric hymn. On the origins of Aphrodite, Carl Kerenyi writes in his Aphrodite chapter in The Gods of the Greeks, "Our great goddess of love was never ours alone. She is the same deity as our oriental neighbors, worshipped under such barbarian names as Ishtar or Astaroth, which we later reproduced as Astarte. In the East, she was a goddess who made peculiarly strong amorous demands, but was also abundantly generous with the pleasures of love. In the heavens, the star of morning and evening, the planet Venus, belonged to her, and among earthly creatures, her especial possession was the dove." In fact, the myths of Aphrodite and Adonis, which we'll get to later in this lecture, go back to myths of Ishtar and Dumuzi, later called Thamus. Hesiod's version of the birth of Aphrodite appears to go back to the Hittite myth of Ishtar's birth, in which an agricultural god, Kumarbi, compare here Hesiod's Kronos, overthrows the sky god, Anu, compare Uranos. Kumarbi then bites off and swallows Anu's testicles, thereby becoming pregnant with Ishtar. To be sure, the close study of the Sumerian goddess Inanna, and of the Akkadian, Babylonian, or Hittite goddess Ishtar, and also of the Phoenician Astaroth or Astarte as a goddess of war, hunting, and love, would greatly enhance our understanding of Aphrodite. The Greek myth of Aphrodite we have is told by Greek men predominantly, with the exception of Sappho and a few others. And in her representations in canonical myth, we might debate to what extent she's even a goddess of women or merely a sexualized projection of male desire. In Greek cult and religion, however, it's quite clear that she is a woman's goddess. Perhaps importantly, perhaps not, Aphrodite does not appear in the Mycenaean Linear B tablets. But this doesn't mean she didn't exist in some form. She is a prominent goddess in Homer, so debates about when she arrived to Greece exactly and the Aegean Islands or Crete are in some ways coextensive with debates about how early Homer's material really is, and how much the story changed between the 12th millennium BCE and 5 centuries later when Homer's poems were written down. Scholars have observed when they read the Iliad and the Odyssey that Aphrodite doesn't seem to be very well integrated into the Olympian pantheon. For example, she's often belittled and excluded from battle. We can definitely say that the Greek Aphrodite represents an extreme reduction or parturition of earlier Greek, Mesopotamian, or Egyptian Greek goddesses into more restrictively sexual or sensual roles and functions. However, this strategy of divide to conquer of the goddess of sex and love or even war was not unique to the Greeks. This process was already well underway and is quite legible for scholars in the history of the Mesopotamian goddess Inanna or the Egyptian Hathor. Interestingly, Aphrodite had the epithet Aria, or the warlike, at Sparta, and this didn't make much sense to the later Greeks who had entirely sexualized Aphrodite. There's now substantive evidence that the Phoenician goddess Astaroth or Astarte was the original Aphrodite, and that she migrated via trade routes to Greek islands like Crete, Cyprus, or Cythera sometime in the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, which might make some sense of her myth in Hesiod, where she's a goddess who comes from the east and emerges out of the sea. This Aphrodite or Astarte in turn goes back to the Canaanite Asherah, who was a consort of El, the high god, or Anat, El's daughter. In a way, we can say Aphrodite gets her name in founding cults in Greece, in a line that goes back to the Jewish Canaanite tribes, and perhaps also even earlier to the Sumerian Inanna or Akkadian Ishtar. In earlier Egypt, the closest equivalent to Aphrodite was initially Hathor, like Inanna, often a vicious war goddess, but in later Egyptian mythology, some of her functions are taken over by Isis. More or less everywhere, but especially in Greek mythology, it does seem that the roles of the great goddess of sexuality and war were divided more extensively than elsewhere. Other than adornment and jewelry, Aphrodite or other Mycenaean goddesses who were like her seem to be associated with the making of perfumes. And during the Mycenaean period, perfume production was one of the most flourishing palatial businesses. While we don't hear the name of Aphrodite in Linear B tablets, we do get wonderful recipes for the creation of olive oil-based perfume, which might be scented with plants like cypress, sage, coriander, and rose. I once attended an exhibit in Paris where you could smell the perfumes created from these ancient recipes and which were manufactured using the ancient techniques. They smelled absolutely wonderful, and it seems they'd be fairly easy to make at home if somebody out there wants to try this for their creative project. We know that in Crete, the epithet Antheia, or flower goddess, was Aphrodite's, and this title may represent her old link with herbal magic, and some of her associated plants like the apple, the myrtle, the poppy, the rose, or water mint. Aphrodite Antheia was also understood as the maker of the morning dew. The children of Aphrodite in later Greek myth are many. We've already heard about her 3 children with Ares, Terror, Panic, and Harmonia, more on her soon. Her child with Hermes is Hermaphroditos, a combination of both their names and the first transsexual. Also with Hermes, but sometimes Dionysus, Pan, Adonis, or Zeus, she is the mother of Priapus, the god of the massively, eternally erect and unquenchable male phallus. Statues of Priapus can be found in gardens and at doors throughout the Greek world. His effigy, often merely a large erect phallus, being considered a scarecrow, a bringer of luck, and a bulwark against thieves. I wonder what the Greeks are saying they're going to do to thieves with that one. Priapus is later extensively mythologized among the Romans as a god of pornography. In Pindar, we hear about the mythical king Rhodas, the divine personage of the island, who was believed to have risen from the sea and was regarded as the son of Aphrodite and Poseidon. With the mortal shepherd Anchises, Aphrodite is the mother of Aeneas. And this we read already in a very early Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. Reading this hymn, Virgil will eventually make Aeneas, who hailed from Troy, Rome's answer to Odysseus and the Odyssey. In some myths, Aphrodite is the mother, with either Uranos or Ares, of Eros himself, or the Erotes, the original Greek Cupids, and of Himeros, Desire, and many others. With Dionysus, Aphrodite is the mother of Iacchos, who is the savior god in Eleusinian mystery celebrations, and whose meaning is pretty esoteric in myth and religion, although his name seems to imply that he is the god of the jubilant mystery shout. More on Iacchos in our units on the Greek mysteries. Lastly, much later Greeks made Aphrodite in her earlier form of Astarte and with Adonis, the mother of Beroe, who is the nymph patron of the city of Beirut in Phoenicia. If you go to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens today, one of the cutest and best preserved works of sculpture portray Aphrodite and an Erote, or the young Eros, being accosted by the satyr god Pan. Aphrodite is looking at him disdainfully and holding up her shoe in order to give him a whack, and the Erote seems to be taunting him, as the much shorter and homunculus-like god Pan looks up lasciviously and seems to be pleased with himself for getting his hand on Aphrodite's booty. In contemporary art, Aphrodite, like Athena or Dionysus, is often reappropriated by BIPOC artists. Here you see Harmonia Rosalis's amazing black or Afro-Cuban Aphrodite, itself a redo on Botticelli's, and if you look up Harmonia Rosalis, you can find a large number of similarly wonderful canvases, which re-envision many of the Greek myths in Western painting. Charlene Spretnak, in her short but helpful book Lost Goddesses of Early Greece, again gives us a helpful summary of Jane Harrison's view of this goddess. Despite being the least chaste of all the goddesses, the earliest Aphrodite might still be considered as virginal or Parthenos in the religious and cultic sense of remaining independent, a fertility goddess of all creation. Thinking of Aphrodite as virginal in the sense of independence, like we did with Athena last week, may work speculatively for an earlier Aphrodite, but I haven't found a place where Aphrodite is called Parthenos in archaic or classical sources, so this can be a bit of a stretch. Also in Jane Harrison, we hear helpfully that when Aphrodite is assimilated into the patriarchal Olympus, a foolish and futile attempt is made to fit her out with a husband, the craftsman Hephaestus. Harrison simply finding no deep meaning in this famous Homeric myth, but rather reading it as a delimitation of the power of Aphrodite. In fact, you might be interested to know that the net in which Homer represents Aphrodite as being caught by Hephaestus was originally Aphrodite's own net as a goddess of the sea, and this net seems to have been worn by priestesses in their spring festivals. Walter Friedrich Otto begins his otherwise amazing chapter on Aphrodite on a definite low note. Quote, "But we can leave the question of historical origins without fear that we shall miss data essential for understanding the Greek goddess. Whatever the Orient or prehistoric Greece may have contributed to her image, its basic character is thoroughly Greek. The idea which the name Aphrodite denotes for us is a genuine expression of the spirit of pre-Homeric Hellenism. And we need to direct our attention only to that idea." Otto proceeds, as we've seen as usual for him, with more hyperbolic Greek and Eurocentric auto-immunizing rhetoric. "Once and for all, let us exclude the Oriental taint." And quote, "The Queen of Heaven, as she is celebrated in Babylonian poems, is utterly foreign not only to the Homeric, but even to the Orphic hymns." Otto's Aphrodite chapter is otherwise great, but this is really facepalm worthy. In fact, the rich recovered poetry of the Sumerian Inanna or later Ishtar, especially the highly sexualized marriage hymns of Ishtar and Dumuzi, can leave little doubt regarding their profound relevance for our understanding of Aphrodite. Ishtar, queen of heaven, earth, and even the underworld, of more or less everything, as well has a holy girdle, and many of Aphrodite's myths, especially the Adonis tale, clearly have Near Eastern roots. If these earlier, more complete manifestations of Aphrodite as Inanna or Ishtar interest you and you'd like to do a comparison project with Aphrodite, here are 4 books on the left that I would particularly recommend. I won't be covering these details in this lecture beyond what's already been said, but consider taking a world mythology class. After that quite unpromising introduction, Otto goes on to define Aphrodite quite helpfully as a goddess of tenderness and of rapture. The language he uses to describe her attributes and appearances is particularly apt. Aphrodite is the goddess of rapture, wantonness, in Greek maklosune, adornment, kindling eros, jewels, enchantment, roses, the pleasures of love, serene and shady retreats, smiling favors, perfumes and aromas, anointments, favorable winds, ravishment, imperishable charm, ensnarement, primal desire, primal wounds, bewitchment, melting grace, conjugal reigns, blissful harmony, havens, prosperity, loveliness, love-strickenness, unconquerability, irresistibility, anguish, and persuasion or pitho, the enticing one who brooks no denial. What a lovely collection of words that particularly evoke Aphrodite. Although calling Aphrodite's attendant persuasion, the enticing one who brooks no denial, does make us wonder again if the Greeks needed a bit of a lesson in consent. In this same vein, Hesiod calls Aphrodite a goddess of, quote, girlish babble, deceit and sweet rapture, embraces and caresses. And she is sometimes nourished or raised by Thalassa, the goddess of the sea in Greek statuary. On her appearance in the 6th Homeric hymn to Aphrodite cited earlier, Otto writes, "What a picture! Beauty emerges from the monstrous element and makes it a mirror of her heavenly smile. Her coming smooths the billows and causes the watery plain to glitter like a jewel. She is the divine enchantment of peaceful seas and prosperous voyages, just as she is the enchantment of blooming nature." Lucretius, the later Roman Epicurean poet, worships Aphrodite similarly as the supreme deity, calling her the goddess of the serene sea. In Lucretius, however, Aphrodite is more tranquil and aloof, untouched by the human condition and immune to our prayers. If Lucretius's Aphrodite interests you for an essay project, you can pick up Venus as Muse from Lucretius to Michael Serres. Next, in her association with the Graces, with whom she dances and bathes, is anointed and clothed, Aphrodite is especially a goddess of sacred gardens, or in Greek, kepoi. In Euripides' tragedy, Medea, the chorus sings of Aphrodite who, quote, sprinkled the land from the fair streams of Cephisus and breathed over it breezes soft and fragrant. Ever on her hair she wears a garland of sweet-smelling roses. Again, the Cretans called Aphrodite Anthea, or flower lady, and celebrated her in the spring blossoms, especially roses in bloom. And the rose is often an image of Aphrodite, as in the poet Tiberianus. Spring, Thallo, is naturally Aphrodite's favorite season. And as a goddess of gardens, Aphrodite often shares this role with her consort Adonis. At the garden altar of Aphrodite on Mount Eryx, it was said that all traces of fire disappeared each morning and dewy green grew in their stead, making Aphrodite, like Dionysus, a goddess of vegetal fertility. Her special plants are tamarisks, pomegranate trees, and as mentioned before, myrtle, roses, apple trees, and poppies, and also many spices and aromatic flowers. The connections of Aphrodite and her consort Adonis to gardens are so extensive that Marcel Deschamps has written a whole book on this, The Gardens of Adonis, Spices in Greek Mythology. As a goddess of sex or rapturous love embraces, the Greek phrase works of Aphrodite becomes synonymous with the pleasure of love and love arts. A concept we hear about already from the priestess Shamet in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The first and longest Homeric hymn to Aphrodite begins, "Muse, tell me of the deeds of golden Aphrodite, the Cyprian, who stirs up sweet passion in the gods and subdues the tribes of mortal men and birds that fly in the air, and all the many creatures that the dry land rears, and all that the sea. All these love the deeds of rich-crowned Cytherea." This early hymn makes Aphrodite a goddess not only of mortal human love, but also of all procreation in the animal and the plant kingdom. And in this role, she's often depicted with the most fierce and sensual animals, such as lions, tigers, panthers, or wolves. Only 3 deities, the hymn goes on, can withstand Aphrodite, and these are Athena, Artemis, and Hestia. Every other god, mortal, or living creature are her slaves. On this note, the tragic poets Sophocles and Euripides will sing of the unconquerability and omnipotence of Aphrodite. And it is from this early Homeric hymn that Lucretius seems to get his image of Aphrodite as the hot desire which suffuses and controls the animal kingdom. Our earliest myth of Aphrodite's coupling with a mortal man, Anchises, is told in the first Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. As the goddess makes her way to handsome Anchises, there follow grey wolves wagging their tail, lions with glittering eyes, bears and swift-footed panthers. Joyfully, the goddess looks upon them and fills their hearts with sweet longing, so that all in pairs they take their pleasure of love in shady retreats. The textbook gives us the whole of this Homeric hymn, and the tale of Anchises begins when Zeus puts sweet longing for Anchises in Aphrodite's breast as payback for all her machinations and getting Zeus in trouble. Anchises is a beautiful shepherd on Mount Ida near Troy, a bit like the Trojan equivalent of Hesiod on Mount Helicon. In beauty, Anchises was like the immortals, and so when laughter-loving Aphrodite saw him, she fell in love, and a terrible longing seized her being. Next, Aphrodite goes to her greatest temple, Paphos in Cyprus, from which we get her epithet of the fluttering eyelids. And there Aphrodite prepares herself with the graces and emerges perfumed in heavenly sweetness. She then hastens back to Mount Ida and finds Achisus alone in his hut, playing his lyre. Disguising herself as a beautiful young virgin, the raiment about her tender breast shone like the moon, a wonder to behold. Desire gripped Anchises, and he addressed her, "Hail to you, O lady, who have come to this dwelling, whoever of the blessed gods you are, Artemis or Leto or golden Aphrodite or well-born Themis or gleaming-eyed Athena, or perhaps you who have come here are one of the Graces who are the companions of the gods and are called immortal, or one of the nymphs who haunt the beautiful woods and inhabit this beautiful mountain, the streams of the rivers and the grassy meadows. I shall build an altar for you on a high mount in a conspicuous spot, and I shall offer you beautiful sacrifices in all seasons. Be kindly disposed toward me, and grant that I be a preeminent hero among the Trojans, and make my offspring flourish in the time to come, and allow me myself to live well for a long time, and see the light of the sun, happy among my people, and reach the threshold of old age." Anchises here seems fully conscious of who he's dealing with, and makes some pretty good guesses about who this disguised virgin might be. In this speech at least, Anchises is doing everything right. But of course, Aphrodite tricks and seduces him by tapping into his primal wish fulfillment. She replies deviously that she is but a mortal and a Trojan princess at that, who was reared in the wilderness by her nurse but snatched away by the god Hermes during her choral dances with other nymphs to Artemis, and then whisked away by Hermes through many light and darksome places, Hermes eventually bringing her to Anchises with instructions that she should marry him and bear his children. Anchises falls for this, of course, and follows her instructions to send word back to her parents about what has transpired, and so that they can send the rich dowry and prepare the proper marriage celebration. In the first Aphrodite sex scene in Western literature, Aphrodite wastes no time in seducing him, but tellingly, she doesn't even have to try. For it is Anchises, having just declared his honorable intentions, who goes on to suggest that they should join in love right here and now, and that not even the god Apollo could restrain him. For after I have once gone into your bed, O maiden, fair as a goddess, I should ever be willing to go below into the house of Hades. Laughter-loving Aphrodite coquettishly creeps into his bed with its fine coverings and soft blankets, including the skins of bears and loud-roaring lions that Anchises had slain on the mountainside. He first removes her gleaming ornaments, the intricate brooches, and the flowers in the necklaces, and next he loosens the belt around her waist and takes off her shining garments and sets them down on a silver-studded chair. Then, by the will of the goddess and of fate, he, a mortal man, lay with an immortal goddess without knowing the truth. Really, poor Anchises here never had a chance. After a deep and sweet sleep, Aphrodite wakes him up mischievously in her full form, which reached up to the well-wrought beam of the roof, and from her cheek shone the heavenly beauty that belongs to Cytherea of the beautiful crown. "Tell me," she says vainly, "if I appear to you like the person whom you first perceived with your eyes." Anchises is terrified and worries for his virility, even for his life, replying, "Now from the first moment that I have looked at you with my eyes, O goddess, I know you are divine, but you did not tell me the truth. But I implore you, by aegis-bearing Zeus, do not allow me to continue to dwell among mortals, still alive but enfeebled. Have pity, for no man retains his full strength when he sleeps with a mortal goddess." And we can wonder in Greek folklore if a kind of physiological curse on a man's virility is implied here, or if it's more simply the death of desire by comparison. Regarding his worries about never being able to get it up again, Aphrodite replies kindly and consolingly. The goddess speaks, "Anchises, most renowned of mortal men, be of good courage and do not be overly frightened in your heart, for you need to have no fear that you will suffer evil from me or the other blessed gods. Indeed, you are beloved by the gods, and you will have a dear son who will rule among the Trojans, and his children will produce children in a continuous family succession. His name, our son, will be Aeneas. Although you can't tell anyone this," Aphrodite adds, "since I am gripped by dread anguish, because I went to the bed of a man. Oh dear, what have I done? I've slept with a mortal man. And now all of his descendants will be the most godlike among men in beauty and stature." We can note how although the goddess is in dread anguish, or Greek ainos, she is not fickle or ruthless to Anchises. and even compares her transgression here to when Zeus carried off fair-haired Ganymede, or when golden-throned Eos, the goddess of the dawn, carried off Tithonus, one of your race. A little bit of fickleness on Aphrodite's part, however, is also implied in the hymn, for although it is in her power to continue to love Anchises and even perhaps to petition to Zeus for his immortalization, this does not seem to be what Aphrodite wants. This may be the first appearance in our sources of Aphrodite making excuses, and she explains to Anchises that while Ganymede became the cupbearer of the gods and Zeus's eternal boy lover, on the other hand, Tithonus was granted immortality but not protection from old age. And so she explains herself to him, I should not choose that you, Anchises, be immortal and live day after day like him, but if you could live on and on a beautiful man as you are now, and if you could be called my husband, then grief would not cloud my anxious heart. This sounds like just about the most subtle breakup letter that's ever been written. She's basically saying there's a 50-50 chance whether you'll turn out like Ganymede or Tithonus, and I'm not willing to chance it since sleeping with you was already a disgrace for me. Here Aphrodite acts selfishly yet affectionately, and immediately digresses with no thought for Anchises or her love for him into more serious worries about her reputation. Now no more will I be able to open my mouth about this power of mine among the gods, since driven quite out of my mind, wretched and blameless, I have been utterly insane. I have gone to bed with a mortal, and I carry his child in my womb. Aphrodite's concern close to the end of the hymn seems to be to save face. And note how she does not experience shame at all for what she's done, only fear at the consequences to her reputation and to her power of persuasion among the gods. The hymn concludes with Aphrodite warning Anchises to keep their one-night stand secret, or he'll be struck with a thunderbolt, and in some myths this is how Anchises actually dies, and she concludes with a long prophecy regarding the rewards that he will be given if he complies, a little bit of blackmail there, especially the birth and might of their son Aeneas. This is of course all perfect material for Virgil to later rework into his Aeneid. And note also how, like in the Eros and Psyche myth, the goddess Aphrodite is already very worried about the survival of her cult even in the 7th to 6th century BCE. Note also how her war connections, which are suppressed by the Greeks, are partly revived among the Romans through Aeneas, and in fact under the Romans her reputation tends to grow. Well, that was getting a little steamy, so I took off my cardigan. And thankfully Otto next points to the fittingness of Aphrodite's associations with marriage and child-rearing. Of course, often the consequences of succumbing to the influence of this goddess. Otto notes how Aphrodite is not a goddess of marriage and conjugal union like Hera is, but still widows and maidens make offerings to her prior or during a marriage, and in Sparta, Aphrodite Hera was worshipped. On Aphrodite's essential nature, Otto writes, from her comes the all-powerful yearning, which can forget the whole world for the sake of the one beloved, but it also can shatter honorable bonds and break sacred faith, only to melt into oneness with the beloved. In this terrifying aspect, Aphrodite does not tolerate mockery and persecutes those who deny her with a horrible savagery. At the same time, she has her favorites, especially men with a strong feminine aspect like Paris, who is the true type of the friend of Aphrodite. In contrast, in the Iliad, Menelaus, Helen's husband, is a friend of Ares, and thus fearsome and manly, but Paris is almost androgynous and a musician or dancer. Paris is warned that when Helen's husband comes, your lyre will not help you, nor the gifts of Aphrodite. Your comely locks and fair favor will be to no avail. In one scene in the Iliad, Aphrodite actually whisks Paris away from a losing duel with Menelaus, placing him directly in Helen's bedchamber. Although he has just come from the battlefield, he's gorgeous, beautiful, as if he'd just come from dancing at a festival of Aphrodite. While the Greeks and Trojans continue to slaughter each other in noble battle, Paris and Helen have the best sex of their lives. Menelaus is declared the victor of the contest. The battle itself becomes the site of the coitus interruptus, but nobody seems to care. The wantonness or maklosune of Aphrodite has prevailed. Otto goes on to underline how Aphrodite is the most beautiful of all the goddesses. This was not only Paris's judgment, but also Zeus's, implicitly at least, when he tried to forestall another battle of the gods by marrying her off to Hephaestus. For Otto, Aphrodite is pure feminine beauty and loveliness itself, bathed in the moist glow of ecstasy, always fresh and untroubled and blissful as the infinite sea which gave her birth. Poets and artists all agree She is the deep-bosomed goddess of golden and smiling laughter, ever attended by amiable and winning charms such as the Graces. And it is these gifts that she also endows in Pandora, the first woman. When once this gift of Aphrodite was passed on to Phaon, a ferryman near the island of Lesbos, and a kind of double of Apollo, Phaon became so handsome that Sappho is said to have cast herself into the sea from the Leucadian cliff for his sake. This myth is a kind of trashy way to round out the life of Sappho and make her ultimately powerless before the beauty of a beautiful man. We'll return to this later. Aphrodite's famous girdle is sometimes in our sources a corset for her bosom, and sometimes an accentuation on her lower parts, although Aphrodite's belt may be different from her girdle. In any case, Hera begs the use of it when she wishes to arouse Zeus's love. Probably the most important attendants in Aphrodite's retinue are Pothos, longing, Himeros, desire, and Pytho, persuasion. And importantly, Aphrodite is said to have invented the magic wheel of love, or the eunuchs, a device used in magic incantations and to cast love spells, which is also associated with the goddess Hecate. Jason is said to have first used the eunuchs to set Medea's heart in blazing tumult with lashes of longing. And as a goddess of the love wheel, of love potions and spells, Aphrodite also appears frequently in the Greek magical papyri. Her appearances in Greek tragic myth and the tragic theater are usually pretty profound and interesting. In Sophocles' Antigone, the chorus sings, "The just themselves have their minds warped by thee to wrong for their ruin. For the will of the goddess Aphrodite is unconquerable." In Greek, amekonon, not to be prevailed upon. It is under the sway of Aphrodite that Haemon, the son of Creon, and his to-be bride Antigone both die in the West's original Romeo and Juliet tale, and Creon and the state of Thebes are all ruined. More on Aphrodite in the Antigone play in our unit on Oedipus and Antigone. In Euripides' play Hippolytus, which we'll look at briefly next week, in connection with the goddess Artemis, Aphrodite is represented as bringing good fortune to men who honor her, but doom to both men and women who don't. She even makes a show of upbraiding any woman who offers resistance to her will. Phaedra, the wife of Theseus, is struck by Aphrodite with mad passion for her stepson Hippolytus, and even the innocent Hippolytus is ruined for not satisfying his stepmother's insatiable lust. Recall how Phaedra's mother, Pasiphae, was inflamed with her unnatural passion for the white bull by Aphrodite. And in a fragment of the lost play of Euripides' Cretan Women, Pasiphae gives an eloquent self-defense by claiming that Aphrodite was wholly responsible. I suppose it's not just men, but sometimes women as well who say in Greek myth, "The god made me do it." As a home-wrecking goddess in tragic myth, Aphrodite destroys security and restraint, as in the case of Phaedra and Hippolytus. And in other tales, she causes great distress by implanting in women blind and often criminal devotion to a strange man. This seems to be how she operates in the tale of Helen and Paris, and also of Jason and Medea. In tragic myth, the love that Aphrodite instills can turn to hate in an instant. And so the chorus in the Medea play sings, "May you never launch at me, O lady of Cyprus, your golden bow's passion-poisoned arrows, which no man can avoid. May moderation or sophrosune content me, the fairest gift of heaven." Here Aphrodite is prayed to, precisely in order to keep her maklosune, or wantonness, away. In the Hippolytus play, a nurse tries to give Phaedra some sage advice regarding her predicament of being inflamed with maklosune for her son-in-law, Hippolytus. "You cannot withstand Cyprus if she rushes upon you full tilt. When she finds a person yielding, she comes on gently. But when she finds a person too high and mighty, she takes him, and what do you think she does? Knocks the pride right out of him." It is pure presumption wanting to be better than the gods. Have the courage to love. A god has willed it. You are sick. Find some way to cure your sickness. Maybe the worst piece of advice ever given by a wise old nurse to a young woman in Greek myth. What it points to is that in tragic myth, Aphrodite is sex positive and patriarchy justifying goddess, but one with a troubling double nature, at the same time violent and fearful, but also rapturous and smiling. It was Euripides who probably composed the greatest choral ode to Aphrodite, which we'll look at in a second, and a closer study of Aphrodite in our surviving tragedies and comedies would be the work of a long and fascinating book. As we've seen hinted at in cult and religion, Aphrodite might be prayed to as a goddess who averts sinful passion. And in Rome, there were cults of Venus Verticordia, which protected young girls and women, especially Vestal virgins, from unchaste longings. While Aphrodite might visit darkness and terror upon ordinary women and wives, in the Greco-Roman way of thinking at least, the purchased love of a temple prostitute is glorified by the goddess. And here we can speak of Aphrodite as a goddess of double standards. Pindar sings of Xenophon of Corinth, who in gratitude for his Olympian victory ever traveled in a company of gorgeous hetaeras. He sings, "Guest-loving girls, ye that burn the golden tears of fresh frankincense, full often soaring upwards in your soul onto Aphrodite, the heavenly mother of love. She has granted you, ye girls, blamelessly to cull on lovely couches the blossom of delicate bloom. For under force all things are fair." Pindar may have had the distinction here of being the first to associate frankincense with Aphrodite in a poem, if that honor hadn't already been claimed by Sappho, and we get a pretty clear insight here into how most Greeks prefer to worship Aphrodite in the form of the hetaira rather than the wife. The force he sings of is here the persuasive force of longing, seduction, and persuasion. And as for the proverb that all is fair in love and war, this as well seems to go back to Pindar's song to the courtesans, to the guest-loving girls. As Otto notes, of real festivals of Aphrodite we know very little, ditto the actual activities of her priestesses and temple cult. We do know, however, that the celebration of the Aphrodisia might occur when sailors returned home jubilantly after a long voyage, this being the first occurrence of the proverbial wartime theme of sailors on shore leave. The last section of his Aphrodite chapter reads a bit like a hymn Otto wrote to the goddess. But he also adds some interesting details to his portrait of Aphrodite. As a friendship or companionship or escort goddess, worship of Aphrodite hetaira might range from the natural up to the sublime heights of the spirit. In several myths and some cult evidence, Aphrodite is also a goddess who protects and remembers the dead. She is the one, after all, who protected and anointed the corpse of Hector, which was being abused by Achilles. And above all, Aphrodite seems to be a goddess of social intercourse. Sorry, that was a bad pun. And in her epithet Epaphroditos, she might be associated with good luck, or even winning throws of the dice, a goddess of gambling. In all three of these connections, as a friendship goddess protecting the dead and overseeing sociality, Aphrodite seems pretty closely connected to the god Hermes, with whom she has the child Priapus. But rather than, like Hermes, being a god of the happy chance, the coincidence, and the windfall, Aphrodite appears instead as a giver of beautifying bliss. Otto's German word here is Seligkeit, as well as of consummation, understanding, conquest, and rejoicing. All these attributes making her quite different than the mischievous Hermes. In Euripides' famous choral ode to Aphrodite, we hear again that ever on her hair she wears a garland of sweet-smelling roses, and ever she sends the loves, Erotes, to assist in the court of wisdom, Sophia. No good thing is wrought without her help. This is a rare moment in the surviving sources where Aphrodite is associated with rationality or wisdom in some sense. And so it makes sense that Otto would hone in on this theme given his argument. Not only a goddess of wisdom, Sophia, and thus of some philosophers like Plato, as we'll see, Aphrodite is also a goddess of the poets. Pindar sings of his singing as loving labor performed in the garden of Aphrodite and of the Graces. On the close connections of Aphrodite and Eros, Otto notes that while Eros is important in cosmogonic speculation, such as in Hesiod or Orphism as we've seen, he is virtually absent in archaic and classical cult and not even mentioned in Homer. For Otto, Aphrodite's realm is far more comprehensive. And this is because her power does not derive from the desiring subject or Eros, but from the beloved object itself, whose truth and shining she liberates and enraptures. Otto explains this difference further by reviewing a few points in Socrates' or Diotimus' speech in the Symposium. In Eros, the position of the lover, the loving, and the urge to take possession and to reproduce is primary. In contrast, in Aphrodite, it is the pure appearance that draws irresistibly into the ravishment of union. Eros needs the other, Aphrodite is the self and the other. Otto goes so far as to define the secret totality and unity of the world of Aphrodite, not as demonic possession like in the experience of Eros, and not even as an actual transgression. On this reading, when Aphrodite is present, union is inevitable, both naturally and spiritually. and men and women are grateful for Aphrodite's gift of receptive, lovable grace, and this is why her daughter by Ares is Harmonia, a goddess very close to Aphrodite who, in Aeschylus, is the executor of Aphrodite's sway over the skirmishes and the reunions of lovers. Otto concludes his chapter by noting correctly that all these features and functions of Aphrodite we've discussed survived far more vividly in Western culture and its concept of cosmos long after most of the ancient myth world had faded away. The centrality of Aphrodite to Greek and Western philosophy and thought was already underlined by the pre-Socratic philosopher Empedocles of Acragas in the 5th century BCE, Empedocles becoming one of the only pre-Socratic philosophers to still be read in later Christendom. In his Metaphysics, Empedocles made love and strife, or philia and eros, the two most elemental gods and world overseers, thus inaugurating the timeless debate of whether love will or will not win out in the end. When Empedocles describes Aphrodite by name, he says that she causes human hearts to beat for one another and produces perfect harmony and unity in the great world epochs. Here in Empedocles, Aphrodite, or Philia, is simply the most cosmic goddess of all, and hence the expansion of her cult around this time and afterwards as Aphrodite Urania, who is opposed to Aphrodite Pandemos and who amazingly becomes syncretized by later Christian theologians with the Virgin Mary. In Aeschylus's play The Danaids, a cosmic Aphrodite even moves holy heaven itself to approach earth conjugally, Aphrodite overseeing the bride-like yearning of the earth for love, and so rain falls from heaven and impregnates the earth, which bears herbs and fruit of the heavenly seed. All this is the work of Aphrodite. As to Aphrodite and Eros' presence in classical Greek philosophy, such as Plato, I'll be covering that a bit more closer to the end of the lecture and in a separate video. In Otto's conclusion, by the time of Lucretius, Aphrodite has become the, quote, goddess of the miracle of love, for she alone has the power to bestow peace upon the world. Lucretius here becoming the first John Lennon. Even the war god Ares, although deeply wounded by love, embraces Aphrodite and fixes his hungry eyes upon her, glutting himself with her, but even the war god is soothed when the goddess lovingly whispers in his ear a sweet prayer for peace. And Otto ends by pointing to the paradox of Aphrodite. She can easily bring and dispense horrible destructive strife and confusion, but she is also the most luminous and blissful harmony. Her greatest attribute is that she brings magic brightness to the dark shadows, and thereby completes creation, which makes her sound here a little bit like the Gnostic goddess Sophia, or thunder. Our textbook covers the myth of Aphrodite and Adonis first, likely because it comes from the oldest stratum of her mythologium, and is also the most famous, this being originally a Phoenician tale of the goddess Astarte. Our sources for the myth of Aphrodite and Adonis are, however, predominantly much later, except for a few tantalizing fragments in poets like Sappho. Let's cover the background myth here first. Very briefly, in Ovid, Aphrodite turns all the women of Cyprus into the first prostitutes for denying her divinity, and then, on account of their own shamelessness, they were turned into stone. Nasty Aphrodite. According to the myth, Pygmalion watched all the women of his island turn into crazed whores, but at the same time he missed their company. And so he fashioned a statue of ivory, white as snow, and gave it a beauty surpassing that of any woman born. Other than Hephaestus' fembots, this may be the first female sex doll in myth. Aphrodite took pity on him and brought the statue, named Galatea in later sources, to life. Ovid gives us both phases of this devotional sex scene. First when the statue is stony, and then when it is warm. Next, the sex doll turned real woman, Galatea, gives birth to Paphos, who had a son, Cinyras, who had a daughter, Myrrha. As one of the most sordid of all Greek myths goes, Myrrha fell desperately in love with her own father, and tormented by her sense of shame and guilt, the poor girl was on the verge of suicide. But then her nurse, note again the naughty nurse, helped her to consummate her incestuous design by the cover of night, and this went on for some time, although the sources are unclear exactly for how long. When Cinyras finally found out, he pursued a fleeing Myrrha in wrath with intent to kill, and Myrrha prayed for deliverance and was changed into a myrrh tree, which continually drips with her tears. Since Myrrha had become pregnant by her father, from the tree was born a beautiful son named Adonis, the most handsome youth and the keenest hunter. Enter stage left Aphrodite, For at the sight of Adonis, Aphrodite fell desperately in love, and warned the young Adonis against the dangers of the hunt, telling him to be especially wary of any wild beasts that would not turn and flee but stood firm. This seems to be not too long after Adonis was the baby that Aphrodite fell in love with. In Ovid's version, Adonis goes off and gets himself killed by a wild boar with a tusk to the groin. And this before Aphrodite had an opportunity to consummate her union with him. He lies dying on the yellow sand, and Aphrodite hears his cries while she is flying to Cyprus on a chariot of swans. She immediately returns, falls upon the corpse in violent lament and wailing, quite uncharacteristic of her, and then admonishes the fates that her memorial of grief for Adonis will outlast this temporary setback. Under the auspices of Aphrodite and founding a cult to him, Adonis's death and resurrection will be annually reenacted and dirges sung as Adonis's blood turns into flowers. Aphrodite begs Persephone and perhaps also Hades and Zeus to allow this, and she reasoned that Persephone had earlier transformed the nymph Mentha into an immortal, so why can't she do the same thing for her Adonis? As Aphrodite tends Adonis's brutal wounds with nectar, Persephone seems to hear her prayer and his bloodied body becomes transformed into anemone flowers. Definitely one of the most bizarre metamorphoses in all of Ovid. The textbook mentions another version of this myth, in which Aphrodite is more clearly the great mother goddess, and Adonis, her lover, a vegetation or fertility god. But again, like with the Chiron myth, it doesn't mention its source, which is Apollodorus' library. Apollodorus writes that 9 months after Myrrha had been turned into a myrrh tree, the tree split open and the baby named Adonis was born. Because of his beauty, Aphrodite concealed him in a chest, keeping it from the gods, this being an interesting parallel to Athena's adoption of Erichthonius. The myth goes on to tell how Aphrodite entrusted the box with Adonis inside to Persephone for safekeeping. But Persephone, like the Dew Maidens and like Pandora, of course, opened the box, and as soon as she got a glimpse of the baby Adonis, she refused to return him. When the matter was brought to Zeus for arbitration, that's when he decided to divide the year into 3 parts or seasons, and decreed that Adonis would spend 1/3 of the year by himself, 1/3 with Persephone, and the rest with Aphrodite. As it turned out, the original or a resurrected Adonis loved Aphrodite so much that he decided to add his solitary time to her portion. In this version, Adonis grows up under the care of Persephone and Aphrodite, and probably consummates a union with both of them during his first life. But later on, while hunting, he was attacked by a boar and died. In her Adonis myth, Aphrodite can be compared not only to Athena, but Aphrodite's dispute with Persephone over Adonis also forms a kind of parallel with Apollo and Hermes' later dispute over preeminence in the eyes of Zeus. More on that later. The textbook concludes this section by noting the parallels between the myth of Adonis and Christianity, for it is possible to detect similarities between the Easter celebrations of the dead and the risen Christ and those in honor of the dead and risen Adonis. Christianity too absorbed and transformed the ancient conception of the sorrowing goddess with her lover dying in her arms to that of the sad Virgin Mary holding in her lap her beloved son. Concluding our coverage of the main myths of Aphrodite, we can look next to her appearance in the Orphic hymn. Heavenly, smiling Aphrodite, praised in many hymns, sea-born, revered goddess of generation, you like the night-long revel, and you couple lovers at night. O scheming mother of necessity, everything comes from you, and you have yoked the world, and you control all 3 realms. You give birth to all, to everything in heaven and upon the fruitful earth, and in the depths of the sea, O venerable companion of Bacchus, you delight in festivities, O bride-like mother of the Erotes, O persuasion whose joy is in the bed of love, secretive giver of grace, visible and invisible, lovely tressed daughter of a noble father, bridal feast companion of the gods, sceptered she-wolf, beloved and man-loving giver of birth and of life. With your maddening love charms you yoke mortals, and the many races of beasts to unbridled passion. Come, O goddess born in Cyprus, whether you are on Olympus, O queen, exulting in the beauty of your face, or if you wander in Syria, country of fine frankincense, or yet driving your golden chariot in the plain, you lord it over Egypt's fertile riverbed. Come, whether you ride your swan-drawn chariots over the sea's billows, joying in the creatures of the deep as they dance their round dances, or as you delight in the company of the dark-faced nymphs of the land. As light-footed they frisk over the sandy beaches, Come, lady, even if you are in Cyprus that cherishes you, where fair maidens and chaste nymphs throughout the year sing of you. O blessed one and immortal, pure Adonis, come, O beautiful and comely goddess, I summon you with holy words and a pious song. This is probably one of the more densely layered and fascinating of the Orphic hymns, and in it we see that Aphrodite is both carnal and spiritual, Aphrodite Pandemos and Aphrodite Urania, and so fundamentally double-natured. In other Orphic hymns, however, sometimes zelos, jealousy or envy, and apate, deception, attend her birth. And for some Orphics, Aphrodite is the daughter of Zeus, born when Zeus himself ejaculated into the sea. She is here a cosmic goddess of procreation, as she is in Lucretius, and also the scheming mother of necessity, Anake or Andrasteia. In terms of the placement of this hymn in the Orphic hymns, Aphrodite is sung only after 3 hymns to Dionysus and to his retinue in festivals, Dionysus and Aphrodite being very closely connected for the Orphics. After the hymn to Aphrodite, Adonis, Eros, and the Graces are sung next, for obvious reasons. The Chthonic or underworld Hermes is said to be her child in the very next hymn after Adonis. In this hymn, as the mother of necessity, Aphrodite is a goddess of compulsion and yoking, who also seems closely connected to Rhea, the mother of the gods. God Pan and the goddess of childbirth, Eileithyia, are among her erotes for the Orphics. Note how Aphrodite here controls all 3 realms, that is earth, heaven, and the underworld. And it's hard not to make a connection here to the earlier goddess Inanna as a queen of heaven and earth, who descends into the underworld yet survives, also becoming in some sense a goddess of the underworld too. The most beautiful and enigmatic line in the hymn arrives when the poet describes her as the bridal feast companion of the gods, or the sceptered she-wolf, which is an extremely cool and beautiful image, and one which links Aphrodite to sacred hierogamies. The rest of the hymn reveals the poet's deep knowledge of all the places where Aphrodite might be when he calls to her, from which he is summoning her to turn around and arrive at the Orphic ritual. The next shorter Orphic hymn to Adonis begins, "Hear my prayer, O best and many-named god, fine-haired, solitary, full of lovely song, Ubolius, many-shaped, and noble nurturer of all, maiden and youth in one, withering bloom, O Adonis, you vanish and shine again in the fair season's turn. Two-horned spirit of growth and blooming, much loved and wept for you are, O fair and joyful hunter of the luxurious main. Desire is in your mind, O sweet blossom and offshoot of Aphrodite and Eros, child born on the bed of lovely tressed Persephone. Now you dwell beneath murky Tartarus, and now again towards Olympus you bring your fruitful grown body. Come, O blessed one, and bring earth's fruits to the initiates." Here Athanasicus notes that Adonis's name is from Semitic origin, Adon, which means Lord, and you can compare here the biblical Adonai, which is a name for God or divinity alongside Yahweh and Elohim. Attis, who we'll look at in a minute, is a very similar figure to Adonis, and is coupled with the great goddess mother Cybele, much as Adonis is coupled with Aphrodite. Adonis worship seems to have landed on Cyprus pretty much at the same time that Aphrodite worship did, but our earliest poem which evokes him is Sappho's Fragment 140. As we've seen, rituals associated with the gardens of Adonis are legion, and he had many festivals dedicated to him throughout the Greek world, which were ever associated with mysterious deaths, laments, and resurrections. The Orphic hymn here combines many of these traditional elements, and it seems to make Adonis a lot like Dionysus. Both are called many-named, wise counseling, and androgynous gods with horns. A close comparison of Adonis with other male fertility gods like Osiris in Egypt or Dumuzi in Mesopotamia would be the subject of a long lecture. Most importantly, in the Orphic hymn, Adonis seems to have 2 births. First, as the sweet blossom and offshoot of Aphrodite and Eros, and next, perhaps in his second birth, as a son of Persephone and Dionysus. The most beautiful phrase in this hymn arrives when the poet describes Adonis as the joyful hunter of the luxurious main. We'll be saving a more in-depth discussion of the myth of Cybele and Attis, which is so similar to the Aphrodite and Adonis tale, for later units when we cover Greek mystery religion. But just in broadest outline here, Cybele is the Phrygian great mother goddess, often identified in later worship with Rhea and called Rhea Cybele. According to myth, she was originally bisexual, but castrated herself, and from the severed organs the almond tree arose. A bit like Mira's myrrh tree. Nana, the daughter of a river god, comes along and plucks the blossom from the tree and puts it in her bosom. The blossom disappeared into her chest, and she found herself pregnant with Atthis. She exposed the child as an infant, but a satyr found and raised him, and he grew into an extremely handsome youth. When the great mother goddess Cybele saw him, she fell in love completely. And since his father was the almond blossom, as well as the Phrygian mother's severed genitals, it does seem that Atthis is also Cybele's son, through the surrogate womb of Nana, making this the earliest myth of sacred surrogacy that we have. Alas, although the great mother Cybele loved her son Atthis, he loved another, and Cybele drove him mad with jealousy such that he castrated himself. Lamenting over what she'd done, she prayed permission to Zeus to resurrect him and make him immortal, and this Zeus granted. Cybele worship was extremely widespread, especially in the Roman world, and from the testimony we have seems to have involved a lot of orgiastic frenzy, including elements of self-mutilation. Cybele's priests were called Galli or Corybantes, and they might very often be eunuchs who had self-performed Attis's castration act in order to prove their devotion to the goddess. Cybele often appears as an even more savage or badass female Dionysus, but she has strong connections with Aphrodite as well. We're not sure how far back her identification with Rhea goes, but we do frequently see Rhea Cybele named together, especially in regards to the Corybantes and their protection of the infant Zeus. Sir James Frazer writes very fancifully on her mystery religion in the Golden Bow, but this is likely more Christianity-inflected, fanciful reconstruction than good anthropology. And since it's not that related to the goddess Aphrodite, we'll be returning to it later in the course. Let's transition now from Aphrodite to the god Eros, who gets hardly any coverage in our textbook and was pretty much dismissed by Otto. And we can begin here with the Orphic hymn to Eros. I call upon great, pure, lovely, and sweet Eros, winged archer who runs swiftly on a path of fire and plays together with gods and mortal men. Inventive and two-natured, he is master of all, of heavenly ether, of the sea, of the land, of the all-begetting winds, which for mortals are nurtured by the goddess of the green fruit, and of all that lies in Tartarus and in the roaring sea. You alone govern the course of all these, but Blessed One, come to the initiates with pure thoughts, and banish from them all vile impulses. This Eros seems very close to Aphrodite in being a god of all three realms, and closely nurtured by Aphrodite herself as the goddess of the green fruit. Here the Orphics seem to be saying that the cosmogonic Eros we hear about in Hesiod and Aphrodite are nearly two sides of the same deity. But the hymn as well underlines, like Otto, the even more dangerous ambiguity of Eros. He might bring vile impulses or frenzied subjective desire, and so is asked only to arrive in one manifestation of his double nature, that of pure thought. In terms of major myths about Eros, the hymn begins from the playful, winged, and cherubic child, common in representations at the time, who runs swiftly on a path of fire. What the Orphics are saying here is that they see Eros at work in the fire of celestial motion. And it is from here that the Orphics proceed to discuss Eros as a more interior force of cosmic procreation, as in Hesiod. The double nature of Eros, just as Aphrodite has a double nature, is also underlined by Sappho, where we find an unusual genealogy according to which Eros is a child of Gaia and Uranos, earth and sky, most frequently in Orphic cosmogonic myth. Eros is identified with the firstborn god Protogonus, who emerges from the cosmic egg of ether and abyss. That is, even more primordially than from earth and sky. And in this appearance, Eros has many epithets in Orphic poetry, both cosmogonic and hymnal. Eros is not only Protogonus, or the firstborn, but also Phanes, Erechthaios, and many others. The main point of this hymn, like the hymn to Aphrodite, seems to be to underline Eros's ubiquity. He is both playful and cosmic, and this double nature or duality can be observed everywhere. The god Eros has already come up many times in the course and in manifold forms. Recall how in Hesiod he was also a firstborn god alongside others, but his origins were left unexplained, Eros simply functioning as the male fecundating principle, the sinew-loosening god who is the basis of all genealogy. We also saw earlier in Aristophanes' play The Birds an even more cosmic Orphic Eros. But as Otto noted, although he's important in cosmogonic myth, he doesn't appear that frequently in archaic and classical cult. The Romans will change this, of course. Where Otto does appear very frequently, however, is in the history of Greek poetry and philosophy. And this starts as early as the Archaic Age. For it is in lyric poetry and philosophy that the Greeks reflected most extensively on the nature of love and desire. Most Greeks would have thought of Eros either as a firstborn god, as in Hesiod or Orphism, but increasingly as a son of Aphrodite, either with Uranos or with Ares. These are the two basic mythic genealogies, but in poetry and philosophy his genealogies multiply, Eros becoming a child of Uranos and Gaia in Sappho, or a child of resourcefulness and need, or Poros and Penia in Plato's Symposium. And oddly, despite being the progenitor of procreation for every living being, Eros has only one unambiguous child in the later Platonic myth told by Apuleius. There, Eros becomes the father with Psyche of pleasure or hedone. In order to approach the centrality of erotic desire, we can begin by recalling Otto on how Aphrodite's realm is more comprehensive. And we might ask why this is so. According to Otto, Aphrodite's power is not derived from the desiring subject, or Eros, but from the beloved object, whose truth and shining she liberates and enraptures. In short, what this means for Otto is that Aphrodite is heavenly consummation, while Eros is demonic desire. While this is interesting and supportable in our sources, we shouldn't forget that the Greeks themselves considered themselves tragic mortals, not immortal gods. The blessing or the curse of Aphrodite was for them a more extraordinary or rare experience. And accordingly, it was the experience of Eros which is primary, not only in human existence, but in all poetry and all philosophy. The poet desires or has Eros for the beloved, and thereby attempts to mediate the ambiguous or blissful, devastating experience of Eros precisely through poetry. Correlatively, the philosopher desires to become wise, and so learns Eros or Philia for what is most worthy of contemplation. It does seem that in both poetry and philosophy, Eros is more in the sphere of mortals. The experience of Eros is one of existential self-initiation. But since Eros is ever a god, he is never without danger for mortals. As the poet Meleagros sings in the 2nd century BCE, "Hard-hearted Eros, if you burn my little soul too often, she will fly away. For she has wings too." Meleagros clearly celebrates the presence of Eros in his soul, but notes that too much of it will cause his beloved to fly away, like Eros. And elsewhere this poet notes that Eros, still a babe in his mother's lap, played at dice one morning and tossed away my soul. Diophanes of Marina tells us that Eros is like a thief. Sharp-eyed, bold, he robs us blind. The lyric poetry tradition consistently acknowledges that we need Eros, but not too much, since the total domination of this god causes lovers to flee, hearts to be broken, souls to be gambled away. All the while, Eros is in the sidelines, a thief, a bit like Hermes, getting rich at our expense. Eros ever has a paradoxical double nature. At once desire and lack, love and hate, blessing and curse, and this way of understanding the god goes back at least to Sappho, if not a lot earlier. It was Sappho who first called Eros bittersweet, glucopikron in her Aeolian dialect, in which the sweetness always comes before the bitterness. Probably there's no better place to turn for a basic understanding of the psychology of Greek Eros, and also to round out our account of the goddess Aphrodite, than a more in-depth engagement with the poetry of Sappho of Lesbos. Amazingly, before the discovery of the Akkadian poet-priestess and Hedwana from the early 2nd millennium BCE, Sappho was for a very long time our earliest surviving female author and the first poetess to speak in her own name. And she is still today the most impactful, famous, and emulated female poet to ever have lived. And this even though only fragments of her work survive. Strabo puts it best when he writes that Sappho is an amazing thing, for we know in all of recorded history not one woman who can even come close to rivaling her in the grace of poetry. Sappho was born on the island of Lesbos, very close to the Turkish border today, and only a century or less later than Hesiod or Homer. Lesbos at the time was a prosperous mercantile island, which had thrown off hereditary kingships and was ruled by aristocratic families vying for power and influence. It seems certain that Sappho was a member of one of these aristocratic families. We know the names of her parents, or any possible names for them, as well as of her daughter Cleis and many of her lovers. But we're not sure about the name of her husband, and this since the Suda runs with a mocking comment in a comic play, which tells us that Sappho's husband was Cercolas of Andros, meaning something like penis from Man Island. She definitely had a daughter, Cleis, who she sings about with deeply moving motherly love. In myth and in history, the island of Lesbos is famous for many things, and we'd need another lecture to cover them all. Its name is the name of one of its earliest gods, Lesbos. And it was called this long before Sappho's reputation and literary afterlife made the word Lesbos synonymous with female homosexuality. The island was famous for its rich traditions, but also for producing the sexiest women, with fascinating Aeolian accents, and who give great lesbian sein, a term that didn't actually refer to female homosexuality among the Greeks, but rather to the art of giving blowjobs. This detail can sometimes seem like a chauvinist appropriation and reaction to Sappho's authority, but it probably also points to the existence of a sex industry on the island of Lesbos, perhaps in later times. The island of Chios, Homer's birthplace, was Lesbos' nearest neighbor, and so given the historical proximity of Sappho, Homer, and Hesiod, reconstructing Sappho's social, economic, and religious context from the evidence has become a huge academic cottage industry in classical studies. For a short vignette in a lecture like this, we alas can't cover everything, but should say a few more words about Sappho's life and works. The Suda also tells us that Sappho's poetry filled 9 papyrus rolls, that she invented a new musical instrument, the plectrum, which becomes her constant companion in vase paintings and later artistic representations, and that she composed in many genres of poetry, not just the lyric. As we'll see in a minute, fragments of her poetry are still being discovered to international sensation, although scholars estimate that less than 1% of her total output survives. The kind of education this would have required for Sappho to become such a prominent poet was very rare for women in the Greek world, even on Lesbos. The dialect in which she lived and wrote was Aeolian Greek, which was reputed to being very pleasing on the ears. These lesbians seem to have been the Irish Gaelic bards of the Hellenistic world, we could say. Because Greek poetry was metrically structured around long and short vowels, its stanza forms were very difficult to master, which has very often led interpreters to imagine that Sappho was the head of a school. Reading Sappho's songs is a bit like reading a score for opera, but we only have a few of the words, none of the music, or dance choreography. We hear in Alcaeus, a male lesbian poet contemporary to Sappho, about an unusual and famous temple dedicated to 3 gods, Zeus, Hera, and Dionysus, on the island of Lesbos. And this may in itself tell us something about the flavor of Greek religion on Lesbos. Zeus and Hera, the gods of the Hieros Gamos, and Dionysus and perhaps Aphrodite, being particularly strong patron gods and goddesses on the island. Sappho became world famous during her lifetime and after her death, as her poetry was very often the most skilled and moving example of a particular style in poetry. The later rhetorician Longinus cites one of her most famous poems, thus preserving it for us, as the most astonishing example he's ever read of the physical effects of desire. Sappho's poetry is full of moving images of childhood, mother's love, and wedding songs across 12 fragments, as well as women's perspective on love and family matters, intimate erotic conversations, often between women, and also invocations of various gods and mythic traditions, especially Aphrodite, Eros, and Hera. Sappho's poetry was so good that even her otherwise stodgy, patriarchal, and law-giving contemporary, Solon, once said that he would have died happy having learned one of her most transcendent songs. And later Plato, who is so often critical of poets, praises Sappho as the 10th muse, not so much on account of the erotic content of her poetry, which most everyone seems to have admired during her lifetime. There is some evidence on a Parnian marble inscription that Sappho was exiled and had to flee between 604 and 595 BCE. No reason is given, but we get some clues from her poetry that the winds may have been shifting in the political situation of Lesbos, causing Sappho to lose a few lover defectors, and resulting in her family house being ousted from the island. Sappho's life and works is just such a fascinating topic that it's sad we're not doing a whole lecture on it, but if this interests you for a possible essay topic, I would super recommend, written for the general audience, Philip Freeman's Searching for Sappho, and also Anne Carson's collection of the complete fragments, If Not Winter. On the question of Sappho's lesbianisms, Carson dreams in the introduction, quite charmingly, and writes that controversies about her personal ethics and way of life have taken up a lot of people's time throughout the history of Sapphic scholarship. It seems that she knew and loved women as deeply as she did music. Can we leave the matter there? I've also included in the modules this week a real jewel of a documentary, probably one of the best documentaries on the ancient Greek world I've ever seen. which was produced by BBC4 Sappho, Love and Life on Lesbos with Margaret Mountford. This is an informative, stunning, and inspirational work of art as far as documentaries go. Before looking at her poetry itself, we should next say a few words about Sappho's ancient and modern influence. Ovid, while he was banished, probably for writing salacious love poetry himself, writes to a young woman poet in Rome and alludes to Sappho. Quote, "So if the fire still burns in your breast as before, only the woman from Lesbos will surpass you." That's pretty good stuff, but it's also in Ovid or pseudo-Ovid that the myth of a lovesick, suicidal Sappho, unable to win the heart of Phaon, gets canonized. And after Sappho's poetry was lost, this became her main myth. Ovid being more or less the only figure that everybody still read which mentioned Sappho. It was pretty convenient for an increasingly patriarchalized literary and religious world to use this tale to dismiss Sappho out of hand. She spent her life loving women, but eventually succumbed to uncontrollable desire for a man and committed suicide. This might be cited as a moral allegory whose meaning is more or less, don't end up like Sappho. Even when Sappho did poetize Phaon, it was very likely by casting him as an Adonis and in the perspective of an Aphrodite ritual to Adonis. And we do have a surviving fragment which reads, "Delicate Adonis is dying, Cytherea. What should we do? Beat your breasts, girls, and tear your clothes." This is a common ritual scene in Aphrodite and Adonis cult, and thus the anecdote about Sappho's suicide in this context is total spurious garbage. As to Sappho's ancient influence, we know the names of about 100 Greco-Roman female poets after Sappho, all of whom aspired to her as their most major influence and unsurpassable model. Male poets also emulated and admired her. Of these later female poets in the lineage of Sappho, only fragments survive, but we do have long and interesting ones from Corinna and Erinna, almost as highly esteemed by ancient readers as Sappho herself. Alas, increasingly, in classical Athens and then throughout the Greek world, Sappho was also slandered and heterosexualized, and by the time of the Byzantine Empire, only a few copies of her works survived, usually cited as examples of sacrilegious smut, or what the Byzantines called tribadism, clitoris rubbing. We know that Pope Gregory took what did survive of Sappho in the Byzantine library and burnt it publicly. Increasingly, Sappho was remembered only as an insatiable prostitute, at best a prostitute priestess, or as a tribadist civilization destroyer, or as a giver of excellent lesbian-zine. Sappho's last words, inherited from the ancient world, were written down by Eustathius. "The stars around the beautiful moon hide back their radiant form when she in fullness shines over the earth." Erinna lived 3 centuries after Sappho, and her poem The Distaff, sometimes called the lesbian honeycomb of Erinna, was very highly prized. One ancient author says that Sappho is better than Erinna at lyric poetry by as much as Erinna is better than Sappho at hexameters. Between Sappho and Erinna, we find Corinna, who sings beautifully from the muse Terpsichore, the muse of the dance, of the Curetes, Rhea, the infant Zeus, and many other myths, and who also sings of her own sleep or waning of inspiration, a bit like the nymph Chelene we learned about in the marriage of Zeus and Hera. "Are you sleeping endlessly? You never did before, Corinna," she asks herself. Other female authors in the Sapphic tradition included Telesina, Praxilla, Anoute, Gnosis, Moiro, Hedula, and Melino, although only Erinna, Anoute, and Gnosis survive in at least a few pages. Erinna is most remembered for her poem about her moving childhood friendship with Bassus. Quote, "As young girls, we held our dolls in our bedrooms, pretending to be new wives, hearts as yet unbroken. But when you went to the bed of a man, you forgot all you heard from your mother as a child. My dear Bassus, Aphrodite filled your heart with forgetfulness." Much more could be said and cited here of Erinna and the others, especially Erinna's lament over Bassus's premature death. But let's turn here now to another poem I've included in the course pack, in his 3rd poem of his breakthrough New Poems, and after Early Apollo and a love song, 3 short poems follow: Erinna to Sappho, Sappho to Erinna, and Sappho to Alcaeus. The first 2 of these are very short works of what we might call Rilkean necromancy, with Rilke as a medium who observes but is barely involved, overhearing a conversation between Erinna and Sappho. First, Erinna speaks to Sappho very trenchantly. "O you, fierce, far-flinging hurler, like a spear among domestic things, I lay among my kin. Your music launched me far. I don't know where I am. No one can ever bring me back. My sisters think of me and weave, and the house is full of trusted footsteps. I alone am distant and given over, and I tremble like a plea, for the lovely goddess burns at the center of her myths and lives my life. Sappho replies briefly and very cryptically to Erinna, I want to fill you full of turmoil, want to brandish you above me, you vine-clasped staff. Like dying, I want to pierce through you and pass you on like the grave to life, your life in all these things. Bonus points for interpreting these two short poems or the song Sappho to Alcaeus in the discussion forum this week. If learning more about archaic women poets of ancient Greece interests you, you can pick up this nice anthology, Sappho's Lyre. On Sappho's modern influence, we can probably begin by noting that she becomes a symbol of the liberation and the creativity of female desire, and also the antithesis of male patriarchal and martial values. As we read in fragment 16, some may say an army of horses, and some men say an army on foot, and some men say an army of ships is the most beautiful thing on the black earth. But I say it is what you love, or whatever you desire. This line will be frequently interpreted as ancient evidence that not everyone in the 7th and 6th century BCE bought into the martial values of Homer's Iliad, and this fragment is wonderfully put to use in many great works of 20th century theory, such as especially in Simone Weil's essay on the Iliad or the Poem of Force. As to the textual history of Sappho's modern reception, 1555 marks the date of the first edition of Sappho, which combines most of the surviving citations. But from here to the 1890s, all that survived of Sappho was one complete poem, or hymn to Aphrodite, one part of a longer poem that breaks off, the famous fragment 31, which we'll look at in a minute. During the first wave of Sappho rediscovery, her pronouns were altered to make the poems heterosexual. By the late 17th century, Boileau's translations opted not to change the text and became a standard. And after this, increasingly Sappho was taken up in attributed and unattributed ways in most all the great modern European poets, and especially by leading female poets and intellectuals. Anne Dacier was a respectable Enlightenment scholar, translator, and widow who did a great deal to rehabilitate Sappho's modern reputation. And Madame de Staël, herself a kind of Sappho, lady of letters and of the salons, the very woman who brought German Romanticism to France and wrote Corinna, played a major role in making Sappho very chic. After this, Christina Rossetti, Mary Robinson, Mary Wollstonecraft, Hilda Doolittle, Sylvia Plath, and many, many others did wonderful things with Sappho's legacy in their own poetry and re-envisioning. We can even say that in a very real sense, Sappho, more than anyone else, gave birth to the Romantic movement, becoming at this time and afterwards a symbol of women's creative autonomy, and later also of male homosexuality, such as especially in Oscar Wilde or Allen Ginsberg. Nowadays, Sappho's lines are frequently found in pop songs such as The Silvery Moon, and today the site of Sappho's birth on the far west of the island of Lesbos still proclaims her legacy, with only women, nudist beaches, and a culture of bohemian sapphic love. We would probably need about 20 slides like this to inventory all the different women whom Sappho visited, restarting her own legacy. And you might look up here Christina Rossetti and Sappho, or Mary Robinson and Sappho, and I especially like Hilda Doolittle's The Wise Sappho, and of course Madame de Staël's Corinne or Italy, loosely based on the Sapphic tradition in Corinna, is still an excellent read today. You could do your essay project on any of these modern female Sappho inheritors. Turning now to a bit of Sappho's actual poetry from the Mary Bernard translation. Here are a few quite evocative fragments, arranged to tell a kind of story. Sappho sings, I took my lyre and said, come now, my heavenly tortoise shell, become a speaking instrument. Although they are only breath, words which I command are immortal. So come now while we dance, come here to us, gentle gaiety, revelry, radiance, and you muses with the lovely hair. They're locked in, oh, the doorkeeper's feet are 12 yards long. 10 shoemakers used 5 ox hides to cobble sandals for them. And I said, Sappho, enough. Why try to move a hard heart? You may forget, but let me tell you this. Someone in some future time will think of us. Just last night I dreamed that you and I had words, Cyprian. This way, that way, I do not know what to do. I am of two minds, and pain penetrates me, drop by drop. So I ask you, sir, stand face to face with me as a friend would. Show me the favor of your eyes. Alas, rich as you are, death will finish you. Afterwards, no one will remember or want you. You had no share in the Pyrean roses. You will flitter invisible among the indistinct dead in hell's palace, darting fitfully. But I have no complaint. Prosperity that the golden muses gave me was no delusion. Dead, I won't be forgotten. Of course, each fragment of Sappho is an isolated line which tells its own story and is part of a poem mostly lost. So while we can see here in the first 3 lines a common theme of evocation, the line here about their being locked in comes from one of Sappho's wedding songs and refers to the bride and groom and the doorkeeper who prevents the rowdy guests from entering and disturbing the couple. Fragments 60 and 100 both bespeak Sappho's consciousness of her own immortal fame and undying reputation, and fragment 63 is about what seems to be an incubatory dream in which Sappho and Aphrodite have words. Fragment 69 and 61 bespeak the effects of Eros, fragment 71 a kind of supplication scene, and fragment 82 is a kind of curse, against whom we don't know. And so in short, the task of trying to situate each of these fragments in all the surviving other fragments and the Sappho scholarship could be the subject of an individual essay. Luckily, we have one more or less complete surviving poem of Sappho's, her prayer to Aphrodite, a song to the goddess which is as much petition as intimate conversation. Here, Aphrodite hears the cries of women in pain and comes to them, and she speaks to Sappho as an old friend and almost nonchalantly. Only Odysseus seems to be as close to the goddess Athena as Sappho is to Aphrodite. Here, Aphrodite is described as Sappho's ally or sumakos, a word that means doing powerful things together, and is usually used in Homeric battle scenes. Deathless Aphrodite of the dazzling throne, child of Zeus, weaver of snares, I pray to you, do not with anguish and pain break my heart. You may note some common images from the poetic tradition here in evoking Aphrodite, but note how much more passionate and visceral Sappho's version of this is. Sappho's core value can probably be identified from another fragment as the Greek habrosune, and this term can also be strongly contrasted with the male Greek obsession with sophrosune, which we might translate as temperance or moderation, nothing in excess. In one fragment, Sappho sings delicacy, nuance. That's what I hold dear. Exactly this. And Eros has made the brightness of the sun and beauty my fortune. Roberto Colasso picks up on this Sapphic word, habrosune, a word that did not catch on among the philosophers and which one can only translate today by mixing notions such as delicacy and splendor, grace and luxury. Life and living well is all about habrosune for Sappho. And so it's interesting that this word shows up in the modern world only after Jacob Hubner used it in 1816 to name a species of particularly beautiful moths. To modern ears, habrosune describes one's unique aesthetic polish or sense of beauty in life. And this is why Jim Powell translates it above with 2 words, delicacy and nuance. It has also been translated as daintiness, graciousness, jouissance, effeminacy, tenderness, womanliness, and sensitivity, and is suggestive of maidenly qualities such as being gentle, soft, flexible, supple, resilient, yielding, or sensitive, as well as pretty, graceful, charming, sensuous, lush, luxuriant, sensual, or opulent. Any of these words might translate habrosune in certain contexts. And here we should also note that despite having a confessed penchant for lesbian love poetry, Solon also recommends against habrapathine, meaning soft living or the easy life. The great scholar Martin West translates habrosune as loveliness, and notes that although it's an inadequate translation, he doesn't know of an adequate one. Powell thinks that sensitivity comes closest, of how to make sense of the preponderance of fragments that seem to be set in wedding festivities or epithalamia. Various theories have been proposed, especially that Sappho was a priestess who officiated at weddings, or maybe even a high-class courtesan, one of whose main gigs was providing the musical song at weddings. Margaret Mountford's documentary helpfully underlines that singing of the gods and of love are natural things for a poet to do, and that we don't need to pigeonhole Sappho into either the role of a priestess or a prostitute to explain this. There is ample evidence that Sappho was a very dynamic, what we might call singer-songwriter, and so she might lead religious dedications to various gods at their temples and festivals, but might also be the main entertainment at a wedding. In the more recent history of Sappho studies, the entire classical studies world, and actually much of the globe, was rocked when lost fragments of Sappho's work started showing up from ancient Oxyrhynchus papyrus fragments. This was a massive find filling 700 boxes, and the vast majority of it is yet to be deciphered. And so we might expect in the future quite a few new fragments of Sappho's poetry to turn up. The first of Sappho's poem that Oxford archaeologists Grenfell and Hunt deciphered from the garbage dump of ancient Oxyrhynchus was a fragmentary prayer and biting satire against her brother Caraxus. The beginning read, "Nereids, grant that my brother come back to me unharmed, and that all he wishes in his heart will come true. And grant that he atone for his past mistakes, make him a joy to his friends and a grief to his enemies, and may no one bring us sorrow again." Sappho here being remarkably frank about her brother's misdeeds. Much more recently, Dirk Obink, the renowned papyrologist, deciphered the brother's poem. "But you are always chattering that Caraxes is coming with a full ship. These things, I suppose, Zeus knows and all the other gods, but you should not worry about them. And we, if someday his head is freed from labor and Laricus becomes a gentleman of leisure, may we be delivered quickly from great heaviness of heart." From these two fragments, here only cited in part, and from other fragmentary testimony and poems, a picture starts to emerge. Laricus, Sappho's younger brother, was not yet mature, still just serving wine in the town hall as a cupbearer, while Sappho's older brother, Caraxes, had taken part of the family's fortune to Egypt, where he squandered it on liberating a courtesan, Dorica or Rhodopsis, the rosy-faced. Recall how in Hesiod's poem Works and Days, one of the main themes and the reason he wrote the poem was to excoriate his brother's bad behavior in a legal dispute over property. Hesiod's brother was vicious, not virtuous, and it seems quite likely, from these fragments, that Sappho is here participating in a similar tradition of excoriating a wayward brother. Other fragments might reveal details about the political events that led to Sappho's exile. For example, she upbraids her former lover, Mika, for leaving or betraying her, i.e. going to the other side. Another recently rediscovered Sappho poem which is really stunning is all about aging and seems to be a work of the older Sappho. Women in ancient Greece were generally lucky to live above 40, but it seems that Sappho was more long-lived. The bare rudiments of this passage were discovered only in 1922, again in the Oxyrhynchus papyruses, but barely legible. 80 years later, however, this poem turned up on the antiquities market on a piece of papyrus that had been used to wrap a mummy. What could be more fitting and magical than a newly discovered Sappho poem about aging, which had to be peeled off a corpse? This discovery was so sensational and caused such a stir that it turned up in the Times literary supplement and was translated in a matter of days, more or less globally. And for this brief moment in the modern history of the Sappho reception, her voice suddenly returned, speaking to the entire world about the realities of aging. The reconstructed poem reads in the marvelous West translation, "The violet-robed muse's lovely gift belongs to you now, children, and the piercing lyre, the friend of song. My body that before was supple, age has already taken by surprise. My raven tresses all turned white. My spirit has grown heavy and my knees too weak to carry me that once were quick to dance as fawns. I grumble at them often, but what good is that? For human beings to be ageless is not possible. They say that once, for love, Dawn of the rosy arms carried Tithonus aboard her golden bowl to the world's end, when young and handsome, but all the same in time, grey age caught up with him, although his wife was an immortal goddess." In the first fragmentary papyrus discovered, we only had a few words from each line, and it looked like Sappho was singing about maidens dancing as fawns. Only the later discovery on the mummy revealed that she was talking about her weak knees, which no longer can dance as fawns as once she did. We've already seen the myth of Eos or the dawn and Tithonus in the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. Recall that Aphrodite might have immortalized Anchises, but didn't really want to and used the myth of Tithonus as an excuse. In the Homeric hymn, it seemed magical thinking, and the omnipotence but fickleness of the gods was center stage. In Sappho's mature poem about aging, to be ageless is simply not possible. Even if the gods could protect and immortalize her, there would be no other fate in store than that of Tithonus. As to Sappho's relationship to and ideas about death or the afterlife, our sources so far are silent. But we do find one fragment where Sappho advises those around her on how they should face her death. It is not right in the house of those serving the muses for there to be lamenting. That would not be fitting for us. The implications of this fragment alone for the spurious myth about the suicidal death of Sappho for love of a man is extremely clear. Sappho loved and appreciated life and was thankful to the gods for the gifts they had given her, but fully accepted the realities of aging and of death. As Freeman comments here, whatever she believed awaited her after death, Sappho knew that her songs would live on. So that being our general introduction to Sappho studies, And the main topic of this lecture being Aphrodite and Eros, let's turn now to a more in-depth look at Sappho's Eros as the sweet bitter. And here our guide will be the astonishing and probably unsurpassable Canadian classical studies scholar and poet Anne Carson. The 3 short opening chapters of her book Eros the Bittersweet, subtitle, an essay on the economy of the unlost. The 3 most commented upon fragments in Sappho that concern Eros are 47, 130, and 159. Eros shook my mind like a mountain wind falling on oak trees. Eros, the melter of limbs, now again stirs me, sweet bitter, unmanageable creature who steals in. And both you and my servant Eros, this last one being a mere phrase. Carson begins, it was Sappho who first called Eros bittersweet, and no one who has been in love disputes her. What does the word mean? Sappho's Eros is both pleasure and pain, contradiction and paradox, a mind and a heart split in 2. The most compact way to say this is that Eros is both sweet and bitter, qualities that Sappho combines in that order and in one word, lukopikron. Not only in Sappho, but in the entire lyric poet tradition, Eros is a very instant of desire, creeping upon its victims, or in Sappho's Greek, orpeton. And Eros is something against which nothing can avail, a makanon. Eros is irresistible sweetness and love, but also bitter enmity and hate, or as Tolstoy puts this in Anna Karenina, and hate begins where love leaves off. Again emphasizing the order, first sweet, then bitter. Carson next points to the Iliad, in which Aphrodite threatens Helen ominously to play her part. However, Helen's own desire for Paris is ever divided between love and hate, sweetness and bitterness. Menelaus, Helen's husband, suffers pothos, longing, and dreams of the flown Helen and their ruts of love in the bed. The Trojan War can be said to have begun when hate seeped in to fill Menelaus's empty void. And thus, although not mentioned in Homer, Eros, in a very real sense, is the god who kicked off the Trojan War. Just like Menelaus or Helen, the later poet Catullus can sing, I hate and I love. Why, you might ask? I don't know, but I feel it happening and I excruciate. But for Anne Carson, Sappho's own pothos or longing is more physiological, less conceptual than this. Sappho's Eros is bittersweet in a sensuous and bodily way, like bitter honey or sweet fire and its parching madness. Bittersweet Eros can be liquidity and rigidity at once. Recall how in Hesiod, Eros was a mingling that, like in Sappho, melts the limbs, and in which thought and sensation are confounded. By the time of the first lyric poet, Archilochus, Eros the limb loosener also crushes and destroys and throws everything into uncertainty. Although in Archilochus this fate is usually being visited upon an innocent maiden, rather than an emotion he experiences himself. Sappho's relation to the blessings and the curses of Eros seems to be far more ethical. She writes, I don't know what I should do. 2 states of mind are in me. Similarly, Anacreon sings, I'm in love, I'm not in love, I'm crazy, I'm not crazy. In the later tragic poet Sophocles, quote, desire keeps pulling the lover to act and not to act. Note that this is the original version of Hamlet's to be or not to be. In all these statements, according to Carson, moral evaluation fractures under the pressure of paradox. Eros, a baleful blessing, is ever double-natured, as we heard in the Orphic hymn, and can lead either to heavenly ecstasies or to the house of Hades. For Carson, Sappho's sweet bitter Eros is like a photographic negative, the very sensitized plate of the poem, from which every successful poem is accomplished and reproduced in performance. Where love and hate converge, the poem is born. Why? In her second chapter, Gone, Carson answers this question and gets right to the heart of the matter, as well as the most important definition of Eros in Western culture, Eros as lack. The Greek word Eros in fact denotes want, lack, or desire for what is missing. And here the lover always wants what he does not have. Indeed, the wanting must be present even in the having, lest there is no Eros. This reality of Eros as lack is what Sappho poeticizes most deeply, and also what Plato in his dialogue The Symposium thinks most deeply. Quote, as Diotima, the priestess from Mantinea, and maybe a literary avatar of Aspasia of Miletus puts this, Eros is a bastard got by wealth on poverty, and ever at home in a life of want. Again, Sappho is the greatest poet, and Plato the greatest thinker of Eros. And while I won't be covering Socrates' speech which he heard from Diotima or Aspasia in this lecture, you can find a short coverage of these topics in the modules for this week in another vignette. Carson goes on, demonstrating her great erudition. In Simone Weil, eros is hunger, like for food, a hunger to love and to be loved. We might even say that eros is a hunger for hunger itself, for its repetition and for its repletion. The 20th century French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre calls this dimension of eros pure dupery and defines eros as a system of infinite reflections. Love is a deceiving mirror game, and it leads ever to frustration. In another French existentialist, Sartre's polyamorous partner and the godmother of second-wave feminism in her book The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir, in another book, The Ethics of Ambiguity, discusses the archetype of the adventurer or the Don Juan figure as one who lives the reality of eros as an excruciating game. For the adventurer, eros is ever the torture of impossible love. For Carson, the psychoanalyst, Jacques Lacan, the greatest inheritor of Freud, says it best when he writes, quote, "Desire, or eros, evokes lack of being under the three figures of the nothing that constitutes the basis of the demand for love, of the hate that even denies the other's being, and of the unspeakable element in that which is ignored in its request." Lacan clearly defining eros here as a triangulation. The history of such profound comments on eros ever goes back to Sappho, all these thinkers speaking of exactly the same perception or paradox already expressed in fragment 131 when Sappho speaks to her female lover, Atthis. "Atthis, your care for me stirred hatred in you, and you flew to Andromeda." Carson asks, who has ever desired what is not gone? No one. The Greeks were clear on this, and they invented eros to express it. In the last short chapter we'll be covering from Carson, Ruse, she gives a masterful interpretation of Sappho's second most famous fragment, fragment 31, arguing that Sappho has here outlined the consequences of defining eros as lack. The fragment reads, "He seems to me equal to the gods, that man, whoever he is, who opposite you sits and listens close to your sweet speaking and lovely laughter. Oh, it puts the heart in my chest on wings, for when I look at you, even for a moment, no speaking is left in me. My tongue breaks and thin fire races under my skin, and in eyes no sight, and drumming fills my ears, and cold sweats hold me, and shaking grips me. Greener than grass I am, and dead. Or so it seems to me." And Sappho goes on, "But all is to be dared, because even a person of poverty," and then the fragment breaks off. In her interpretation, and Carson here drops the last phrase, but I've included it despite the ellipsis, because of this wonderful idea it contains. In eros, everything is to be dared or ventured, and this because even a person of poverty. Who knows what Sappho was going to say next, but we can perhaps imagine here the very relationship that Plato underlines when he says that eros is really a child of poverty and resourcefulness. What was Sappho going to say next? Perhaps that even a person of poverty has a share in the wealth and resourcefulness of love? Here we can only speculate, and this is precisely Carson's point when she reads this as a floating poem on a stage set with an extremely vague program, and actors who come in and out of focus anonymously. Most basically, it seems that here Sappho is pining for a girl who's in the company of a gorgeous man, but we don't know why the girl is laughing or how she feels about her companion. In fact, we have no real idea how any of the three individual characters, Sappho, the girl, or the man, feel, think, or intentionalize eros in this moment. But that's precisely the point. The most important thing about this poem is, like in Jacques Lacan's definition of eros, it configures the presence of eros as a triangulation. There is not only Sappho, the poet, as potential interloper, but also the girl who is laughing and the man who draws close to her. Each of these three figures has their own relation to eros, and thus to the others. The most common simplistic interpretation of this poem is that it's about jealousy. But why then does Sappho seem to take such a bittersweet delight in the scene? We see no traces of coveting, resentment, or usurpation, and Sappho's eros seems to be more for the scene itself than for the girl. Were she, Sappho, to trade places with the man who listens closely, she would be entirely destroyed. We could almost say that this is the first scene in Western literature of an unambivalent polyamory. And this despite, as Sappho sings, the ambiguous physiological effects of such eros. To further bring home this contrast between eros and triangulation and eros as ruse, Carson next compares a Hellenistic epigram. Quote, "If you looked upon my beloved and were not broken by desire, you are either totally a god or totally a stone." We might imagine that in Fragment 31, Sappho is choosing to become a goddess, becoming herself an onlooking Aphrodite. But Carson as well rejects this explanation of the poem. Why? Because after line 5, the girl disappears, and Sappho's own body and mind are the unmistakable subject of all that follows. What the poem is really about is erotic seeming. As Sappho underlines, he seems to me, and later, I seem to me. It is a poem about the eros that appears to Sappho, and in this way we could say that Sappho's Fragment 31 is the first poetic phenomenology of eros, letting eros show itself in itself and singing it forth. Carson here preferring the word stereoscopy. Either way, the meaning is the same. Eros appears in full stereo or surround phenomenalization in Sappho's poem. The truth of desire only becomes visible when the triangulation or tripartite structure of erotic desire shows forth. For Carson, we must resist the temptation to understand erotic triangulation as a mere ruse. For the activation of eros as lack always by definition requires 3 structural components: the lover, the beloved, and that which comes between. When the 3 points of this circuit meet, perception or eros leaps. The man sits like a god, the poet almost dies, these being 2 poles of response within the same desiring mind. Carson concludes this chapter with a beautiful observation that in this dance of erotic triangulation, the people do not move, rather desire moves, and eros is a verb. Amazingly, all these subtle points that Carson teases out of Sappho's poem are more or less what Diotima of Mantinea says about love in Plato's Symposium. The rest of Carson's book is equally brilliant, and I would rank this book as one of the top 10 books in classical studies relevant for a modern audience, and it's also another great topic for an essay project. On the figures of Eros and Aphrodite in Plato's Symposium, the textbook gives us most of Aristophanes' speech and also Socrates' speech, and introduces the dialogue as telling of a select gathering at the house of Agathon, a dramatic poet. Of all the texts that have come down to us from ancient philosophy, it is in Plato's Symposium that we find the figures of Eros and Aphrodite most profoundly and transformatively explored. If you're interested in Greek symposia culture, the best book on this is probably James Davidson's Courtesans and Fish Cakes. There are many speeches given about love at this symposium, but the 2 most interesting are delivered by the comic poet Aristophanes, and then most importantly, Socrates' speech about love, which he said he learned from the priestess Diotima. It is in Aristophanes' speech that we hear about eros as lack and as a search for lost wholeness. Originally, human beings were hermaphroditic, kind of like Siamese twins. Comically, the first humans had 2 heads and bodies, and 8 limbs, and were constantly attached at the genitals, and so experienced a constant and profound comfort. According to this myth, men and women were created when the original hermaphrodite was separated, and this is why we're always lacking our other half or the partner to complete us. And it also explains why human beings try out many love partners, ever searching for the one that fits just right. There's a depth to this myth, of course, but Socrates' speech, which he heard from the priestess Diotima, far surpasses this. In the end, in Plato's dialogue, Aristophanes is still stuck a little bit too much on Aphrodite Pandemos, common Aphrodite, whereas understanding Eros as an intermediary spirit or daimon, the space between, and accepting that our erotic relationships will always be a triangulation, is necessary for realizing the true philosophy of love, and so learning to love higher things in accordance with the stages of Diotima's ladder. It is in Socrates' or Diotima's speech about love that the myth of Aphrodite Urania, first mentioned by Aristophanes, reaches its highest expression. Alright, so we've arrived now close to the end of this lecture. The manifestations of Eros and Aphrodite in Greek religion, myth, poetry, and philosophy, check. No discussion of Aphrodite and Eros in the ancient world would be complete, however, without some coverage of the myth of Eros and Psyche. If Ariadne is the first mortal female to be transformed into a goddess, Psyche is the last. It is in Apuleius, a Roman author of the 2nd century CE, in his novel, sometimes called The Metamorphosis, sometimes The Golden Ass, who alone from all our ancient sources tells Psyche's tale. And he puts it at the center of his novel regarding the adventures of his semi-autobiographical character, Lucius. Most all scholars agree that the tale of Eros and Psyche pre-existed in folktale and fairy tale. In Apuleius, it is transformed into a Platonic allegory. The scholarly reception and interpretation of the myth of Eros and Psyche divides into 2 main camps, and in line with this, The two most widely read translations are by Eric Newman, a Jungian psychologist, and also earlier by Thomas Taylor, a Neoplatonic philosopher. Thomas Taylor having given us the most beautiful translation of this myth. For an introduction to Apuleius, his writings, and his time, Earl Fontenelle's History of Western Esotericism podcast is excellent, episodes 73 to 74. And if you don't have time to read the tale this week, which would be a real shame, I've uploaded Earl's marvelous retelling in the modules with his permission. We don't have time here to get into all the details of the plot, so let's just look briefly into the meaning of this myth. If the archetypal psychological interpretation of this tale interests you, you can read Eric Newman's extensive commentary, although I'd warn that it's not quite as good as Marie-Louise von France's, who was Jung's privileged disciple and wrote voluminously on the topic. Carl Jung as well thought this myth to be especially significant. Von Franz, Newman, and Jung all agree that what we see in Psyche's tale is a process of interiorization of the gods. Whereas previously the gods had been worshipped as forces and entities external to the human subject, in modern consciousness the divinities are buried as archetypes that continue to live only in the depth of the collective unconscious. No longer being objective presences in the world, as in Otto's rationalistic and natural interpretation, the gods themselves become features of the human psyche, and this process unfolds very gradually, from Apuleius' time to our own. What is so fascinating about the tale of Eros and Psyche is that read in a modern psychological way, it marks the very moment of the flight or death of real gods in the world, and with that, the becoming divine of the human subject. Nobody reading this tale can really understand it without looking into the reasons for Aphrodite's wrath. Back to basics, Eros is here called by his Latin names Cupid or Amor, and he appears as a handsome winged youth, as in myth. Psyche's name means soul or butterfly, and her tale is here an allegory of the union of the human soul with the divine. The kids' version of the beginning of this tale might read, "Once upon a time, a king and a queen had 3 daughters, of whom Psyche was so beautiful that Venus, Aphrodite, was jealous. She ordered Cupid to make Psyche fall in love with the most vile of creatures. But instead, Cupid himself fell in love with Psyche. She was transported to a magnificent palace, the original beauty with her beast, since each night Cupid, as an anonymous bridegroom, visited her and departed quickly before sunrise. Why is Aphrodite jealous of Psyche? Simply because men are neglecting her cultic religion, and rather merely courting the women they love in her name, setting aside for the moment the Platonic reading of Psyche's spiritual quest, as well as the psychological reading of the divine's interiorization through Psyche. Most obviously, this scene marks the moment of a decisive forgetting of the great goddess Aphrodite. Her worship is being neglected and her temple is falling into ruin. And all this takes place while a mere mortal woman is being worshipped in her place. Aphrodite's wrath against Psyche corresponds to the cry soon to be heard across the Mediterranean, "The great god Pan is dead." We can say what we want about the petty or vengeful aspects of Aphrodite's characterization in this myth, but the fact remains that Aphrodite is the one who sets Psyche's trials, ordeals, and the heroine's journey, which eventually results in Psyche's apotheosis. The enmity between Psyche and Aphrodite in the tale actually speaks their divine closeness. The love of a mother for her son Eros, which is universal and unconditional, is here transferred to the wife Psyche, corresponds to Psyche's ambivalence and immaturity in her love for Eros. And it is only through wounding the god husband, which precipitates Eros's return to the mother, that Psyche's own love becomes unconditional and eternal. But she must still pass all of the mother's tests in order to become worthy of Aphrodite's greatest son. The brilliance of Apuleius' interpretation of this folk tale is how many myths he embeds in each of the myths within it. Apuleius himself was a committed Platonic philosopher, and so there's zero reason to doubt that the allegorical interpretation of this myth is the correct one. Nevertheless, the psychological or historical interpretation, which makes Psyche's tale part of the history of modern consciousness, is equally necessary for us moderns at least in order to decipher the myth. As a Platonist philosopher and poet, it seems clear that Lucius thinks of Psyche as the world soul itself. First in its marriage with, then separation from, and ultimate reunion with, love or eros as the ultimate divine. Platonically, the tale tells of the soul's restless aspiration to attain the divine and to keep it. and in the context of the novel, this tale is placed at center. Lucius, the protagonist of the Golden Ass, journeys away from the courtesan Fotis towards the goddess Isis. That is, he moves from a less spiritual to a more spiritual love, just like Psyche. And so according to the Platonist interpretation, most clearly expressed in Thomas Taylor, there are in fact two Venuses and two Cupids in this story. Again, Uranian or celestial and Pandemian or common. It is the higher and virtuous Venus as goddess of marriage who ends up accepting Psyche into her divine family. But there is also the lower or Pandemian Venus who binds in her embrace all enslaved bodies. Similarly, the tale tells of a baser Eros who is groveling over his wounds and ever a mischief maker or wanton boy. But there is also a higher Eros, the good husband who loves Psyche devotedly and unites with her in Olympus to redeem the divinity of their child, Pleasure. These two Cupids and these two Venuses are battling it out across the tale over the fate of Lucius's soul, and this becomes clear when we read the myth in the context of the novel. It's pretty incredible that Apuleius' Golden Ass is the only complete surviving Roman novel. Apuleius initially models his character Psyche on Callirhoe because that tale was the most famous novel of Greek antiquity, and amazingly it's also survived. Apuleius' Psyche thus starts out as the sweet heroine of the Greek love romance, but she soon becomes the tragic heroine sacrificed in a wedding to death. Apuleius seems to be building the myths of Persephone, Iphigenia, or Antigone, as well as the myths of Hera or Demeter into Psyche's character. And it is only once pregnant, after Eros has fled, that Psyche begins her pilgrimage throughout the world like a second Io. Finally, in the last trial imposed by Venus, Psyche even descends to the underworld, thereby becoming a second Aeneas or Heracles. The cosmopolitan esotericism here is pretty thick. Aphrodite, formerly the queen of heaven and earth, in her form as Astarte or Ishtar, seems to live the myth of descent into the underworld vicariously through Psyche. Ishtar becomes the only goddess to successfully die and be resurrected from the underworld. Symbolically and archetypally, Psyche is becoming Ishtar here, however under the stern tutelage of immortal Aphrodite. Indeed, it is Aphrodite who sends Psyche on this mission to the underworld to meet the queen Persephone and request of Persephone a little bit of her beauty. Psyche succeeds in the descent and ascent, but like vainglorious Aphrodite, she's just far too curious about what's in the box, and also wants a little bit of Persephone's beauty for herself. Aphrodite never received the box, and in all probability never needed it. And instead of finding beauty in the box, Psyche finds death, a death-like sleep. We could say that Psyche's sleeping beauty, errant mortality, despite all her triumphs, is exactly what by the end proves Aphrodite's point, and also serves to revitalize her cult. Psyche, a mortal, is not in the end a second Aphrodite. And so it makes sense that in the moment of her ultimate failure, Zeus intervenes and Aphrodite softens, and Aphrodite learns to accept Psyche. Spoiler alert, but the tale ends with Eros and Psyche's ultimate hierogamy. Then, straight away, he, Jove or Zeus, bade Mercury catch up Psyche and bring her to heaven. This done, he offered her a goblet of ambrosia and said, "Psyche, drink of this and be immortal. Then Amor shall never leave your arms, and your marriage shall endure forever." And so Apuleius gives the conclusion of the tale. Forthwith, a rich nuptial banquet was set forth. The bridegroom reclined on the couch of honor, holding Psyche to his heart. So too Jove lay by the side of Juno his spouse, and all the gods took their places in order. If the marriage of Thetis and Peleus or Cadmus and Harmony are the first ones that all the gods attend, the marriage of Psyche and Eros is the last. All the gods offer their blessings, and thus did Psyche, with all solemnity, become Amor's bride. And soon a daughter was born to them. In the language of mortals, she is called Pleasure. In Latin, voluptas, from which we get voluptuousness, or in Greek, hedone, pleasure. Whatever interpretive lens we use for this tale, it's clear that by the end, Aphrodite, Eros, and a new goddess, Psyche, are fully reconciled. They live happily ever after, or as German folktale puts this, and if they haven't died, then they are still living today. While Apuleius' myth shows the mortal woman Psyche undergoing a ritual descent and ascent and becoming in herself the world soul, only a retrospective modern consciousness considers Psyche the main protagonist. The real star of this show is the goddess Aphrodite herself. In her double form, Apuleius' Aphrodite is the connection or marriage between the material and the transcendental world. Apuleius' Aphrodite is ultimately the goddess of the sacred marriage or hierogamy, of the visible material world in which Psyche is first enmeshed, and the invisible realm or the world soul to which she ascends. Apuleius is a pretty good Middle Platonic philosopher, but of course the later Proclus is better. And so again, I'll conclude this lecture with a reading of Proclus's 2 hymns to Aphrodite. For here, much like in Apuleius, Aphrodite and her Eros is the world's soul, the Psyche that vivifies all, and still the greatest goddess of the Hieros Gamos or sacred wedding, despite her Greek subdivision into Hera, Demeter, and Persephone. Proclus sings to this more general and cosmic Aphrodite. We hymn the lineage of many names, of she born from the foam, the mighty royal fount from which all the deathless winged erotes have sprung up. Some erotes shoot at the soul with transcendent arrows, so that receiving the spiritual goads of desire, they may long to see the fiery courts of their mother. Some, because of the evil-averting wishes and designs of their father, the father who ever wants to increase the endless world with its progeny, places desire in souls for an earthly life. Still others look away towards the varied paths of wedding songs, so that they might fashion from mortal stock a deathless race of long-suffering humans. But all are concerned with the deeds of Cytherea, the begetter of love. But goddess, for you are far-hearing, no matter where you are, whether you embrace the great heaven, where they say that you dwell the divine soul of the everlasting cosmos, or whether you dwell in the upper air beyond the rims of the 7 orbits, pouring your unconquerable strength into your lineage. Hear me, straighten the painful course of my life, O mistress, with your just shafts, putting an end to the icy thrust of my unholy desires. What a masterwork by Proclus. Note how the erotes are both the anagogic daimons who assist in the ascent, the spiritual goads of desire, as well as the source of the mischief of Eros. The multi-locality of Aphrodite herself is here more metaphysical than mythical. She is herself the world's soul whose chief attribute is love, but also the guardian of the descent into matter, the queen of the 7 orbits of the planetary sphere. We can imagine the individual mortal woman, Psyche, ascending through Aphrodite's planets, eventually dwelling with her and her husband Eros in the world's soul itself. What Proclus asks of the goddess Aphrodite is extremely simple, stated in the 2 lines at the end. Goddess, straighten the painful course of my life, overturn the unjust shafts of the erotes in their demonic mischief, and put an end to all my unholy desire. While we might read this as a kind of asceticism, a kind of denial of the sexual function of Aphrodite, or a preference on Proclus's part for the supersensible and transcendent over the sensible physical world. In fact, what Proclus sings is delightfully ambiguous and obscure. What the man Proclus asks for is not an end to desire, eros, or the pleasures of love, but an end to unholy desire. And he hopes that the rich sensuality of the goddess Aphrodite herself will be present in his loving mortal life for the time that remains. How on earth did Proclus, like Sappho we might say, develop such a close relationship with the goddess Aphrodite? To explain this, scholars have noted that Proclus was raised in Xanthos in Lycia, and that he was a member of a very old aristocratic family with a long history in his region of singing to the Aphrodite who listens. Unlike Lucretius's aloof and transcendent Aphrodite, and even unlike Apuleius' Aphrodite, who reflects the conflict in Apuleius' own soul, and in a perfect harmony with Sappho's Aphrodite, Proclus's Lucian Aphrodite oversees the greatest of all blessings for mortals, which is ever the sacred wedding of gods and mortals itself, the ultimate initiatory event of hierogamy. Who knows how this stuff happens, but Proclus's hymn to Lucian Aphrodite as a goddess of the sacred wedding has also survived. It reads, "We sing a hymn to the young maiden Aphrodite, queen of the Lucians, Once the leader of our fatherland, divinely inspired, overflowing with her assistance that averts evil. She erected a holy statue in our city which holds the symbols of the spiritual marriage and of the spiritual wedding between fiery Hephaestus and Aphrodite, the daughter of the sky. They, meaning the Lucian ancestors, and they called the goddess Olympian on account of whose power they often escaped the man-destroying arrow of death. They held their eye on excellence, and a stalwart, bright-minded race sprouted up from the fertile beds, and everywhere was a bountiful sea calm in their lives. But do now accept the sacrifice of our eloquence, O goddess, for I am myself of the blood of the Lucians. Lift up my soul again from ugliness into a greater beauty, fleeing the ruinous goad of earth-born desire. In Proclus, suspicion is not cast on the marriage of Aphrodite and Hephaestus. Rather, the wedding of the heavenly Aphrodite with the creative demiurgic Hephaestus is in fact the highest and the best type of hierogamy that mortal love can hope to emulate. The goddess of love is of the heavens, and Hephaestus, the god of the forge and creative techne, is chthonic and of the earth. Hephaestus's realm is not the self-enclosed earth, however, but the earth that opens itself to the mirroring of divine forms. Hephaestus here becoming the chief lieutenant or herald of the one paternal mind of the cosmos and even the demiurge himself. Again, we'll get back to this Hephaestus in our unit on Schelling. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture on Aphrodite and Eros, Sappho to Psyche. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you all next week.